For 13 years, I had given everything to my wife's father's company. My time, my energy, my ideas, and my loyalty. I had worked through weekends, missed vacations, and sacrificed sleep, all to transform the struggling firm into an empire worth $85 million. It wasn't just a business to me. It was my creation. I had built it from the ground up, turning failed ventures into strategic successes, closing deals that others deemed impossible, and making my father-in-law's name synonymous with power and prestige. Yet, as I sat at the grand dining table that evening, surrounded by family members who had no idea of the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior, I heard the words that changed everything. "Your wife's new husband will take over now." The voice belonged to my wife. Her tone was smooth, practiced, like she had rehearsed saying it. Her father, seated at the head of the table, merely smiled in agreement, as if this was just another business decision, another shift in power that I should accept without question. My grip on the silverware tightened, but I forced my expression to remain neutral. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing my anger, my betrayal. The betrayal of a man who had dedicated his life to a cause, only to be cast aside like an employee whose contract had expired. I glanced around the table. The rest of the family was chatting, eating, oblivious to the significance of what had just been said. Or maybe they knew, but they had chosen to stay silent, unwilling to challenge the patriarch's decision. That was how it had always been. What he said was law. And I had been a fool. A fool to believe that loyalty mattered. A fool to think that years of hard work and sacrifice would make me irreplaceable. A fool to assume that my wife, the woman I had built a life with, saw me as her partner rather than a placeholder. Her new husband. I looked at her then, truly looked at her, and realized something I should have seen long ago. She had never fought for me, never stood up for me, never challenged her father's authority, even when his choices were unfair. She had simply played the role of the obedient daughter, the princess waiting for her father to arrange the best possible deal for her. And now, she had been promised to another man. Not because I had failed her, not because I was lacking, but because I was no longer useful to them. I placed my fork down gently, smoothing my napkin over my lap, maintaining the mask of control that had carried me through countless business meetings. I wouldn't react, not here, not now. They expected anger, they expected resistance, they expected me to protest like a man who didn't see the game they were playing. But I saw it now. The room filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation. And yet, to me, everything had gone silent. I had built them an empire, and they thought they could hand it over to another man while I walked away quietly. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dim glow of my study, staring at the documents stacked neatly on my desk. Financial records, contracts, agreements, all the proof of what I had given to this company, to this family. They had underestimated me. They thought I was just the workhorse, the fool who had built their fortune while they held the reins. But they had forgotten something important. The horse they had ridden for 13 years had learned to run without a rider. And if they thought I would simply walk away from everything I had built, they were gravely mistaken. By 3 a.m., I sat alone in my home office, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the determination on my face. Sleep had no place in my mind tonight. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I combed through every document, every contract, every financial statement I had ever signed. The betrayal from earlier that evening still rang in my ears like a haunting echo. "Your wife's new husband will take over now." Those words should have broken me. They should have shattered my resolve. But instead, they had ignited something far more powerful, an unwavering fire to take back what was mine. For 13 years, I had been methodical. While my father-in-law had played the respectable businessman and my wife had lived in luxury, I had been making moves, subtle, quiet, but undeniably strategic. I was not a fool. I had seen the way power shifted in this family, how loyalty was never a guarantee, how the only person I could ever truly trust was myself. And so, I had ensured that my control over the company was not just symbolic. It was legal, ironclad, and absolute. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I pulled up the executive shareholders agreement. The numbers stared back at me, a stark reminder of what I had orchestrated over the years. 62%. That was how much of the company I owned. Not my father-in-law. Not my wife. Not the stranger they had handpicked as my replacement. Me. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. They thought they had boxed me into a corner, but they had no idea that I had already built an escape route. They expected me to disappear quietly. Instead, I was going to remind them exactly who they were dealing with. As the clock struck 8:45 a.m., I walked into the company headquarters, not as a man who had been discarded, but as a man who was about to burn their carefully laid plans to the ground. The lobby was already bustling with employees, executives, and assistants moving between meetings. Some offered me nods of respect, others glanced at me with uncertainty. The whispers had already started. Did he hear the news? Will he step down? What's he going to do? I ignored them. I wasn't here for rumors. I was here for war. Taking the elevator to the top floor, I strode into my office, my presence alone sending a wave of tension through the space. My assistant, Danielle, looked up from her desk, her face betraying none of the chaos that must have been circling through the company grapevine. She had been with me for nearly a decade, loyal, sharp, and always 2 steps ahead. "Schedule a board meeting for noon," I said, setting my briefcase down. She hesitated only for a second before nodding. "Understood. Anything else?" "Yes," I said, my voice calm. "Call the legal team. I want them ready." Her gaze flickered with understanding. The fight had begun. By the time I settled into my chair, I was already anticipating their next move. My father-in-law would waste no time. He would call in his favors, push the executives to accept the transition, frame it as a necessary shift in leadership. He would use my wife's name to solidify his argument. After all, who would question a man passing his business to his daughter and her new husband? The problem was, I wasn't just a name on a piece of paper. I was the name on the contracts that mattered. At exactly 9 a.m., as if on cue, my office door swung open without so much as a knock. My father-in-law entered first, his presence as overbearing as ever, followed by my wife, her posture poised as if this was nothing more than another meeting. And then, he walked in. The so-called new husband. Tall, young, confident, exactly the type of man my father-in-law would consider worthy of taking my place. He exuded arrogance, a smugness that came from believing he had already won. I almost laughed. "I assume you're aware of the transition," my father-in-law said, his voice carrying the weight of expectation. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers together. Transition? Interesting choice of words. The man beside my wife smirked, as if he found this amusing. I ignored him. He was nothing more than a placeholder, a pawn in someone else's game. My focus was on the real threat, the man who had orchestrated this betrayal in the first place. "We need you to oversee the handover," my father-in-law continued. "We expect full cooperation." I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. They really thought they had everything figured out. "You don't have the authority to make that decision," I said, my voice eerily calm. A flicker of irritation passed over his face. My wife's expression barely shifted, but the smug look on her new husband's face faltered. I reached for the remote on my desk and pressed a button. Behind me, the massive screen on the wall lit up, displaying the executive shareholders agreement. Their eyes darted to the document. Confusion set in first, then panic. "This document states that any transfer of power requires approval from the majority shareholder," I said, watching as the reality of the situation dawned on them. And that would be me. Silence. Heavy. Unmistakable. For the first time, my father-in-law's mask of composure cracked. "This is impossible," he muttered. "No," I corrected, my voice cutting through the tension. "What's impossible is thinking I would spend 13 years building something only to let you steal it from me." I turned my gaze to my wife. "Did you really think I wouldn't see this coming?" I asked her, my voice laced with disappointment. She didn't answer. Her hands tightened into fists at her sides. I let the silence stretch between us before shifting my attention to the man standing beside her, the one who had walked in thinking he was about to inherit an empire. "You have 2 choices," I told him. "You can work under me, or you can walk out that door and never step foot in this company again." His face turned red, his jaw clenched. He looked at my wife, then at my father-in-law. He had expected a victory lap, not a public humiliation. He stormed out without a word. My father-in-law hesitated for a fraction of a second before following. My wife lingered for a moment longer. She met my gaze, searching for something. Anger, regret, weakness. She found none. I had spent years building this empire, and if they thought they could take it from me, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The air in my office was thick with tension long after my father-in-law and my so-called replacement had stormed out. My wife was still standing there, her hands clenched at her sides, her carefully curated mask of indifference slipping ever so slightly. She wasn't used to losing. Neither was her father. But today, they had lost. I leaned back in my chair, watching her closely. She was waiting for me to break the silence, to give her something. An explanation, an argument, a reaction. But I wasn't playing that game anymore. "You knew," she finally said, her voice quiet but edged with something sharp. "You knew all along." I tilted my head slightly, as if considering her words. What exactly did I know? Her nostrils flared. "Don't play dumb. You knew what my father was planning. You knew he was going to transition the company to—" She stopped herself before saying his name. She didn't have to. I let out a slow breath, tapping my fingers on the desk. "Of course I knew," I said smoothly. "I know how your father operates. He's predictable. He thinks power is something he can shuffle around like a deck of cards. He underestimated me, just like you did." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "This doesn't have to be a war, you know." I laughed, the sound dry and humorless. "It already is, darling." Her gaze flickered to the massive screen behind me, still displaying the shareholder agreement, the document that had just dismantled all of their carefully laid plans. I saw the realization in her eyes, the understanding that the life she had expected, the seamless transition she had envisioned, had just gone up in flames. "So what now?" she asked. "You think you can just keep me out? That my father will accept this?" I stood up, slowly, deliberately, and rounded the desk. She stiffened slightly as I stopped right in front of her. "Let's get something straight," I said, my voice low. "Your father doesn't run this company anymore. I do. If you want to stay in this game, you'll do it on my terms." She scoffed. "You don't control me." I smiled. "No, but I control what matters. And right now, that's the future of this company. If you thought I was going to just step aside and let you and your new husband waltz in, you don't know me as well as you think." Her jaw tightened. She had always been good at masking her emotions, but I knew her too well. She was panicking. "This isn't over," she whispered, her voice carrying more desperation than confidence. "Oh, I know," I said. "It's just beginning." She turned on her heel and left, slamming the door behind her. I exhaled, rolling my shoulders back. The first battle had been won, but the war was far from over. I had thrown a wrench in their plans, but I knew my father-in-law well enough to understand that he wasn't the type to accept defeat easily. He had spent decades building his reputation, surrounding himself with people who feared him, admired him, obeyed him. I was about to become the one thing he had never accounted for, his equal, or worse for him, his superior. I pressed the intercom button on my desk. "Danielle, call a board meeting. Noon." "Understood," she replied instantly. I needed to secure my position before my father-in-law tried to rally the board against me. Money and influence could make people disloyal in a heartbeat, and I wasn't naive enough to think I didn't have enemies among the executives. I walked over to the window, looking down at the city below. I had spent over a decade building this empire, and for what? To be discarded? Replaced? Humiliated? No, not a chance. At noon, the boardroom was filled with executives. Some of them looked anxious, others neutral. A few were clearly waiting to see which way the tide would turn before choosing a side. I took my seat at the head of the table. "I know many of you have heard rumors," I began, my voice steady. "So let me clear them up. Yes, my father-in-law intended to replace me. No, that will not be happening." Murmurs rippled through the room. I let them speak amongst themselves for a moment before continuing. "I've built this company into what it is today. Every deal, every expansion, every strategic move, I've been at the center of it. And I won't allow a man who hasn't spent a single day working here to walk in and take what I built. One of the executives, a man I had always respected, cleared his throat. Your father-in-law has significant influence. He could make things difficult. I met his gaze head-on. Perhaps. But let me make one thing clear. If anyone in this room believes that backing him is the right move, speak now. Silence. Heavy, deafening silence. Good. Loyalty matters, I continued, my tone softer but no less firm. And those who stand with me now will be rewarded. Those who don't? Well, you should know me well enough to understand that I don't forget disloyalty. I let my words settle. This was a game of power, and I had just made my position clear. By the time the meeting ended, I had secured the support I needed. My father-in-law could try to fight me, but he was about to learn something important. I wasn't the man he thought he could control. By the time I returned to my office, Danielle was waiting at the door. Your father-in-law called, she said. He wants to meet. I smiled. Of course he did. Tell him I'll see him tomorrow, I said. At my convenience. As she walked away, I sat back in my chair, exhaling slowly. The battle lines had been drawn, and I had no intention of losing. By the time I stepped into my office the next morning, the weight of what had happened over the last 24 hours was still sinking in. My father-in-law had miscalculated, badly. He had spent years believing he could manipulate, control, and discard me like a piece on his chessboard. He hadn't accounted for the fact that I wasn't just another pawn. I was the one who had built the kingdom, and now I was the one who held the power to burn it down. My phone buzzed on the desk. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. I knew exactly who it was before I even picked up. Speak. A familiar voice crackled through the line. You think you've won? I smirked, leaning back in my chair. I know I have. A slow, measured exhale came from the other end. You've made a mistake, son. A mistake that's going to cost you everything. That's funny, I said, twirling a pin between my fingers. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the only mistake was thinking you could take what's mine. Silence. I let it stretch between us, savoring the shift in dynamic. For years, my father-in-law had spoken to me with authority, with the certainty that I would always fall in line. Today, for the first time, that authority was gone. We should meet, he finally said, his voice tight. We should, I agreed. But on my terms. My office. 1 hour. I hung up before he could argue. I wasn't going to let him control the setting, the tone, or the circumstances. If he wanted a discussion, it would be on my turf, under my rules. The next 60 minutes passed in strategic preparation. I had Danielle pull up every document, every financial report, and every legal agreement that mattered. I wanted them printed and stacked neatly on my desk, not because I needed to review them, but because I wanted him to see them, to understand that I wasn't just prepared. I was untouchable. At exactly 10 o'clock, the door to my office swung open. My father-in-law walked in, his presence as imposing as ever, dressed in his usual crisp suit. He was followed closely by my wife, ex-wife, really, though she hadn't realized it yet, and trailing behind her, the man they had chosen to replace me. I ignored him entirely. He wasn't important enough to acknowledge. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and gestured to the seats across from me. Sit. They did. Reluctantly. You think you can just lock me out of my own company? My father-in-law's voice was sharp, laced with barely concealed fury. I smiled. I don't think. I know. I tapped the stack of papers on my desk. 62%, remember? That's my share. Which means I make the decisions now. Not you. Not her. I nodded toward my wife, whose expression remained unreadable. And definitely not him. Her so-called new husband shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. This is a family business, my father-in-law pushed. And you're no longer family. I tilted my head. Funny. You had no problem with me being family when I was the one securing multi-million-dollar contracts, expanding the business, and cleaning up your financial messes. His jaw clenched. I continued. You're right about one thing, though. This is a family business. But see, I was smart enough to make sure that blood ties don't equal ownership. I slid a document across the desk. This is the revised executive structure I filed this morning, I said casually. Effective immediately, your title as chairman is revoked. Your board privileges are suspended. Your access to financial accounts? Gone. You no longer hold a single voting right in this company. My father-in-law's face turned red. You can't do that. I raised an eyebrow. I already did. My wife, ex-wife, leaned forward, her voice softer but no less sharp. Why are you doing this? I turned my gaze to her, finally giving her my full attention. Why? I repeated. You really have to ask? She didn't flinch, but I saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. You stood by while your father plotted to erase me, I said, my voice steady. You let him decide that I was disposable. You sat there at dinner, smiling, while he handed my legacy to someone else like I was nothing more than an employee who had overstayed his welcome. I didn't. You did. I cut her off. And now, you get to watch as everything you thought was yours slips through your fingers. Silence. The man beside her, her new husband, was visibly uncomfortable. He had come here expecting a smooth transition, a welcoming handoff. Instead, he was sitting in the room with the man he had tried to replace, realizing just how out of his depth he truly was. I turned back to my father-in-law. You built this company, but I made it an empire. And now? Now, I own the empire. I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket. I suggest you start making peace with that. For the first time in his life, my father-in-law looked at me not with control, not with arrogance, but with something close to fear. He had underestimated me, and now he was paying the price. He stood abruptly, shoving his chair back. You'll regret this. I smiled. No, you will. He turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. My wife hesitated. For a brief moment, I saw something in her eyes. Maybe regret, maybe realization, but it didn't matter anymore. She had made her choice, and I had made mine. She turned without another word and followed her father out. I finally turned to the man who had been left behind, the one they had planned to install in my place. He swallowed hard. Look, man, I cut him off with a single glance. Get out. He scrambled to his feet and all but ran out of my office. As the door closed behind him, I exhaled slowly, letting the silence settle. The battle wasn't over yet, but today, I had one, and I wasn't done winning. The morning after the confrontation, the weight of my victory still lingered in the air, thick and undeniable. But I knew better than to celebrate too soon. My father-in-law wasn't the type to bow out quietly. No, he would retreat, regroup, and come back swinging. He had spent decades building his power, surrounding himself with men who owed him favors, men who would gladly stab me in the back if it meant securing their own positions. Which was why I had to move first. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, stepping into the sleek glass tower that bore my legacy. The employees who had once greeted me with polite smiles now looked at me with something different, hesitation, uncertainty. The whispers were growing louder. The company had become a battlefield overnight, and everyone was waiting to see which side would come out on top. Danielle was already waiting in my office when I walked in, her hands resting on a thick stack of files. She had worked with me long enough to know that I wouldn't be resting after yesterday's events. They're rallying, she said without preamble. I didn't need to ask who they were. How many? I asked, taking off my jacket and draping it over the chair. 5 board members met with your father-in-law late last night. 3 more were contacted this morning. He's offering them incentives, bonuses, future positions, anything to convince them to vote against you in the next emergency board meeting. I smirked, shaking my head. Predictable. He's desperate, I mused, taking a seat and glancing over the documents she had prepared. Desperate men can be dangerous, she warned. She was right. My father-in-law was many things, but he was never a man who accepted defeat easily. If he couldn't beat me fairly, he'd try to do it by force, by twisting the narrative, by making me look unstable or incapable, which meant I had to make my next move loud enough that no one dared challenge me again. I flipped open one of the files, scanning the contents. It was a detailed audit of the company's financials, one my father-in-law never expected anyone to see. You went digging, I said, lifting an eyebrow at Danielle. You pay me to be thorough, she responded with a shrug. I leaned back, taking my time to absorb the numbers in front of me. Hidden losses, mismanaged funds, embezzlement disguised as business expenses. My father-in-law wasn't just trying to push me out. He was trying to cover his own tracks. I exhaled slowly, tapping my fingers against the desk. How much does the board know? Nothing. He's kept it buried well. And if we release this? Danielle hesitated for a fraction of a second. It would destroy him. I nodded, my mind already working through the angles. Schedule a board meeting, I said. For when? Today. Her eyes flickered with understanding. No hesitation. No second-guessing. I'll make the calls. The battle lines had been drawn, and today, I was going to end it. By noon, the boardroom was filled with executives, each of them wearing carefully guarded expressions. They knew something was coming. My father-in-law was already seated at the far end of the table, his posture stiff, his eyes locked onto me the moment I entered. I didn't look away. I took my seat at the head of the table, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. I called this meeting for one reason, I said finally, my voice even, to discuss the future of this company. A few of the board members exchanged glances. My father-in-law leaned forward, his fingers interlaced. The future is already being decided, he said smoothly. The question is whether you'll accept it or fight it. I smiled, tilting my head slightly. Oh, I'm not fighting it. I'm shaping it. I reached into the folder in front of me, pulled out a thick stack of documents, and slid them across the table. These are the company's financial records, I announced, watching as the executives leaned in, specifically records of mismanaged funds, hidden debts, and unauthorized transactions. The reaction was immediate. Murmurs rippled through the room, eyes darting toward my father-in-law. This is nonsense, he snapped. Is it? I challenged, flipping to a specific page and turning the document toward him. Because this right here? This is a record of $14 million funneled into offshore accounts under your name. The room fell silent. One of the board members, a man who had always been one of my father-in-law's closest allies, cleared his throat. Is this true? My father-in-law's expression barely flickered, but I saw the tension in his shoulders. He was cornered, and he knew it. This is a private family matter, he said, his voice quieter now. No, I corrected, my tone sharp. This is a corporate matter. And as the majority shareholder, I have a duty to protect this company from corruption. More murmurs. The tide was shifting. I leaned forward, driving my point home. You wanted to take everything from me. Instead, you just handed me everything I need to take you down. A long pause. Then, finally, my father-in-law exhaled slowly, his gaze meeting mine. For the first time, he looked truly defeated. What do you want? He asked. Your resignation, I said without hesitation. Effective immediately. More silence. Then, to my surprise, he nodded. Fine. A quiet gasp from one of the board members. Even my wife, ex-wife, looked startled. And the shares, I added. Transfer them to me. My father-in-law clenched his jaw. You're pushing it. No, I said simply. I'm ending it. A long pause. Then, finally, he sighed, pushing the documents back toward me. You really are ruthless, he muttered. I smirked. I learned from the best. And just like that, it was over. My father-in-law left the company that day. My wife didn't follow him, not immediately. She lingered, watching me, but I didn't spare her a second glance. I had one, and nothing would ever be the same again. By the next morning, the entire city knew what had happened. The headlines splashed across business news outlets were as brutal as they were satisfying. Corporate power shift, the end of an era at Hastings Enterprises. Chairman resigns amidst financial misconduct allegations. Hastings' empire crumbles, the rise of its true architect. I sat in my office, sipping my morning coffee, reading through each article with a quiet satisfaction. The war was over. The battlefield was mine. My father-in-law had been forced into resignation, stripped of the company he had once commanded. His shares, once a symbol of his iron grip, were now in my name. And the best part? He hadn't even tried to fight back, because he knew he had lost. Danielle entered without knocking, holding a tablet. You made every front page. Some say you're a genius. Others are calling you ruthless. I smirked. Both are true. She set the tablet down and gave me a pointed look. You should know something. Your ex-wife has been calling. Repeatedly. I didn't react. I had been expecting that. Let her call. Danielle hesitated. She also came by the building earlier. Security turned her away. I exhaled slowly. She's not used to being ignored. Clearly, Danielle muttered, before shaking her head. One more thing, you're getting interview requests. Bloomberg, Forbes, even a few international networks. Everyone wants a comment. I chuckled. They want to know how I managed to dismantle a legacy in under a week? Something like that. I leaned back in my chair, considering. The truth was, I had no interest in feeding the media frenzy. Let them speculate. Let them build their narratives about power, betrayal, and corporate warfare. The only thing that mattered was control, and I had secured it. Decline all of them, I said. Danielle raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. She knew me well enough to understand that I didn't do anything for public approval. And my schedule for today? I asked. You have a meeting with the new board at 2 p.m., she said. They're eager to know what direction you want to take the company in now that it's fully yours. I nodded. Good. Make sure all financial reports are on my desk before then. I want to go in with every number at my fingertips. Danielle turned to leave, but paused at the door. And about your ex-wife? I didn't look up from my coffee. She made her choice. She can live with it. Danielle nodded and left. For a moment, I allowed myself to lean back and close my eyes. The past few days had been an all-out war, but I had emerged exactly where I needed to be, at the top. And I wasn't about to let anyone drag me back down. By noon, I received another call from her. I ignored it. By 12:30, a message came through. We need to talk. I smirked at the simplicity of it, as if a few words could undo everything. By 1 o'clock, she sent another. Please. That one made me pause. Not because I felt anything for her. I didn't. That part of me had been erased the moment she sat at that dinner table and let her father dictate my replacement. No, I paused because I recognized desperation when I saw it. And desperate people were unpredictable. By 1:45, I arrived at the boardroom. Executives were already seated, their postures stiff, their eyes watchful. They had spent years under my father-in-law's rule, conditioned to follow his lead. Now, they were looking at me, unsure of what to expect. I let the silence stretch as I took my seat at the head of the table. Let's not waste time, I said, steepling my fingers. I know there are concerns. I know some of you were aligned with my predecessor. But let me make one thing clear. This company doesn't run on loyalty to a name. It runs on results. A few of them shifted in their seats. We're not going to waste time mourning the past, I continued. We're going to move forward. And those who are ready to do that, you'll be rewarded. The tension in the room eased slightly. These were business-minded people. They didn't care about sentiment, they cared about profit. And if I could make them more money than my father-in-law ever did, they would fall in line. I spent the next hour laying out my strategy, expanding global operations, restructuring inefficient departments, securing new international partnerships. By the time the meeting ended, the board was no longer uncertain. They were intrigued, and I had them exactly where I wanted them. That night, as I was leaving the office, I saw her. She was waiting in the lobby, standing near the entrance in a fitted gray dress, looking as polished as ever. I could have walked past her. I could have ignored her completely, but a part of me wanted to hear what she had to say, if only to watch her scramble for an explanation. So I stopped. She looked up, relief flashing across her face. You finally decided to see me. No, I said simply. I just didn't feel like pretending you don't exist. She flinched slightly, but recovered quickly. Can we talk? In private? I studied her for a long moment. Then, without a word, I turned and walked toward the side exit. I knew she would follow. Outside, the night air was crisp, the city lights reflecting in the glass windows of the building I now fully controlled. She wrapped her arms around herself, hesitating. I didn't want this, she finally said. I laughed, shaking my head. You stood by and watched it happen. She stopped herself, frustration flickering in her eyes. I didn't know how to stop it. You didn't try, I said coldly. Silence stretched between us. I made a mistake, she admitted finally. I nodded, shoving my hands in my pockets. Yes, you did. Her lips parted slightly, as if she had been expecting a different response. She exhaled. I just want to know if there's any way to fix this. I looked at her then, really looked at her. She had been the woman I once trusted, once believed in, and now she was just another person who had underestimated me. No, I said, my voice even. You don't get to fix this. You don't get to rewrite the ending. Her eyes flashed with something. Anger, regret, maybe even grief. But none of it mattered. I turned and walked away, because some things weren't meant to be salvaged, and she had made her choice. As I walked away from her, I didn't look back. There was no need. Whatever desperation she was feeling now, whatever regret had crept into her heart, it was too little, too late. She had watched me be discarded like an afterthought, had stood silent as her father tried to erase me from my own empire. And now, she wanted to fix things? There was nothing left to fix. I stepped into my car, exhaling slowly as I gripped the steering wheel. My phone vibrated in my pocket, and I already knew who it was before I even glanced at the screen. Another message from her. Please, just one conversation. I didn't bother responding. Instead, I turned off my notifications and pulled out of the parking lot. There was work to be done, a company to run, a future to secure. The past could keep calling, keep begging, but I was done answering. By the time I got home, my body was exhausted, but my mind was sharp. I poured myself a drink, stepping onto the balcony of my penthouse. The city sprawled before me, alive and endless, glittering under the night sky. I had won. Everything they had tried to take from me, I had taken back, and more. The company was mine now, fully mine, and for the first time in years, I didn't have to answer to anyone. No father-in-law dictating my future. No wife standing in the shadows, complicit in my downfall. So why did I feel this quiet, lingering sense of anticipation? Because I knew the game wasn't over yet. People like my father-in-law didn't just walk away. They regrouped. They retaliated. And I was ready for it. The next morning, I was back in my office before the sun had even fully risen. Danielle was already there, as always, her efficiency unmatched. She slid a file onto my desk before I had even taken my seat. You were right, she said simply. I flipped open the file and scanned the contents. A meeting had taken place last night. My father-in-law, a few of his old allies, a handful of investors who had benefited from his reign. They're looking for a way back in, Danielle continued, trying to gather support, frame you as reckless, unstable. I smirked, setting the file down. They're desperate. Desperate men do dangerous things. She wasn't wrong. Do we have leverage on any of the investors? I asked, already knowing the answer. Danielle nodded, flipping to another page in the file. 3 of them have questionable financial histories. Offshore accounts, unreported earnings, some borderline legal dealings. If they push too hard, we can squeeze them. And the rest? 2 of them are just waiting to see who comes out on top. They don't care who runs the company, as long as their money keeps growing. Then we make sure they know where the real power is. I picked up my phone and dialed the number of the most influential investor on that list. A man who had built his fortune on the backs of others, who had never truly cared about loyalty, only profit. He answered on the second ring. I was expecting your call. Then you already know why I'm calling, I said smoothly. He chuckled. Your father-in-law has been very persuasive. He thinks you're too aggressive, too impulsive. He's making a case that the company is better off under someone calmer. And what do you think? I asked. A pause. Then, I think I like making money. And right now, you're the one making it. I smiled. Glad we understand each other. He chuckled again. For now. But power shifts quickly in this world. Be careful, son. I always am. I hung up and turned to Danielle. That's one secured. Now let's deal with the others. By noon, I had locked in the majority of the key investors. They were staying with me, at least for now. That left my father-in-law with fewer allies, fewer options, and fewer chances to claw his way back. At exactly 3 p.m., my office phone rang. I picked it up without hesitation. I was wondering when you'd call. You're making a mistake. My father-in-law's voice came through, calm but firm. You keep saying that, but I'm still here. And you? You're not. A pause. Then, this isn't over. I smirked, leaning back in my chair. It is for you. Silence. Enjoy your retirement, I said, then hung up. I exhaled, setting the phone down. Game over. That night, I returned home and found another message waiting. From her. I miss you. I stared at the words for a long moment, then deleted the message without responding. She had chosen her side, and I had one. I stepped out onto my balcony, the city stretching before me. For the first time in years, I was exactly where I was meant to be. Untouchable, unstoppable, and finally, free. By the next morning, the dust had settled, but the game wasn't over. Power struggles never truly ended. They just shifted, reshaped themselves into new battles, new challenges. The difference now? I was the one holding the sword. I arrived at the office before sunrise, the city still waking up as I stepped into the towering glass building that bore my legacy. Employees were moving through the halls, whispering, stealing glances my way. They weren't used to this version of me, the man who had once worked silently in the background, now the man in charge. Danielle was waiting in my office, already scanning through her tablet. She barely glanced up as she spoke. Your ex-wife was seen leaving her father's house late last night. Sources say she's distancing herself from him. I smirked. Of course she is. She sees the writing on the wall. Danielle finally looked up, giving me a pointed look. You think she's doing this for you? I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. No, she's doing it for herself. Because that's who she was. She had spent years aligning herself with power, making sure she was always on the winning side. Now that her father had been cast out, she was looking for a way to reclaim her position. What do you want to do about it? Danielle asked. I leaned back, considering. Nothing. Let her flail. Let her wonder if I'll let her back in. Let her feel what I felt the moment she betrayed me. Danielle nodded, not arguing. She knew better than anyone. I didn't act out of emotion. I acted out of strategy. What else? I asked, shifting my focus back to business. The remaining board members are aligned with you, at least for now. The investors who were on the fence have backed down. But there's still one problem. I arched an eyebrow. And that is? She slid a document onto my desk. Your father-in-law still has influence. He may not have ownership, but he has connections. If he wants to make things difficult for you, he can. I glanced over the document. It detailed his remaining assets, his political ties, his ability to manipulate certain markets. He's not done fighting, I mused. No, Danielle agreed. He's just waiting for an opening. I exhaled slowly, tapping my fingers against the desk. Then I won't give him one. Schedule a meeting with the board, I said. I want everything airtight before he makes his next move. Already on it, she said, stepping out of the office. I turned my chair toward the window, gazing out over the city. This was the part no one ever talked about, what happened after you won. People assumed victory was the end, but it never was. Power had to be maintained, defended, strengthened, and I wasn't about to let anyone take it from me again. By noon, the boardroom was packed. The atmosphere was different now. No more uncertainty, no more divided loyalties. They all knew where the power lay. We're going to discuss expansion, I said, scanning the room. Hastings Enterprises is no longer just a domestic firm. We're taking it global. A few surprised glances. Some nodded, already considering the implications. We've relied too long on old strategies, I continued. We were reactive. Now, we're going to be proactive. New markets, new investments. We don't sit back and wait for opportunities. We create them. An executive shifted in his seat. That's going to require aggressive funding. I smiled. I'm aware. Danielle slid another document across the table. We've already begun securing private capital. Within the next 3 months, We'll have the liquidity needed to make our first international acquisition. Murmurs of approval. My father-in-law had spent years treating this company like his personal kingdom, using it to consolidate power rather than actually grow it. That was his biggest mistake. He played defense. I wasn't going to. I was going to conquer. That night, as I was leaving the office, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I already knew who it was. I answered, bringing the phone to my ear without speaking. A slow exhale on the other end. You've made your point. I smirked. Have I? A pause. Then, you think you've won. You think this is over. It is over, I said, stepping into my car. You just don't want to accept it. You're playing a dangerous game, son. I'm not playing anymore. You are. And you lost. Silence. Retire, I continued. Enjoy what's left of your influence before it disappears completely. Because if you come at me again, I won't just take your company. I'll take your legacy. A long pause. Then, finally, you really are ruthless. You taught me well, I said before hanging up. I set my phone down, exhaling. That was the last time my father-in-law ever tried to challenge me. 3 months later, Hastings Enterprises secured its first international acquisition, expanding into European markets. The numbers skyrocketed. I watched from my office window as the stock price climbed, the city lights reflecting in the glass. I had won. Not just the battle, the war. And no one would ever take this from me again. That night, I got another text. From her. I still love you. I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. I don't. And with that, I blocked her number. Because power isn't just about winning. It's about knowing when to walk away. And I was never looking back. The city never truly slept, and neither did power. While the rest of the world moved through their routines, I was already steps ahead, calculating my next move. Power wasn't just about holding on, it was about expanding. And if my father-in-law had spent decades defending his empire, I was going to spend the next decade building mine bigger than he ever imagined. The office was quieter than usual when I arrived the next morning, my footsteps echoing in the executive hallway. Hastings Enterprises had already begun its global expansion, and the first phase of international acquisitions was locked in. But there was still work to do. Danielle was waiting for me, as always, a fresh folder in her hands. Numbers from our latest acquisition, she said, handing it over. I flipped it open, scanning the reports. The company we had just acquired was already proving to be a gold mine. Revenue up 17% in the first quarter, with even higher projections for the next fiscal year. This is good, I said, nodding. It's more than good, she corrected. It's a statement. The market knows you're not just holding ground, you're growing. That was exactly the point. My father-in-law had spent years playing safe, keeping the company in familiar territory. But power wasn't about safety, it was about dominance. Any pushback? I asked. Not from the board, she said. But your ex-wife has been making calls. I didn't react. To who? Some of the investors. A few of the remaining executives who were loyal to her father. I exhaled slowly, tapping my fingers against my desk. She's looking for a way back in, Danielle continued, trying to leverage whatever influence she has left. And how are they responding? So far, they're ignoring her. But if she keeps pushing, someone might listen. That was the problem with people like her. They never accepted when they had lost. She had aligned herself with power her entire life, always making sure she was on the winning side. And now, for the first time, she was powerless. Let her try, I said finally. It won't change anything. Danielle hesitated. She also showed up at the building again this morning. Security turned her away. I chuckled, shaking my head. She's getting desperate, Danielle noted. Let her be, I said simply. Danielle studied me for a moment, then nodded. She didn't need to say it, but I could hear the unspoken words in her silence. This isn't over. And maybe, in her mind, it wasn't. But for me, it had been over the moment she let me be erased. By mid-afternoon, I was on a conference call with a potential partner in Dubai, discussing another major acquisition. We were expanding fast, and the world was paying attention. Your reputation precedes you, the man on the other end of the call said. The way you handled your transition of power was ruthless. I smiled slightly. Business isn't personal. Oh, but it is, he chuckled. Every move you make tells the world who you are. And right now, the world is watching. I knew that. I welcomed it. By the time the call ended, I had secured another partnership, and Hastings Enterprises was another step closer to becoming a global powerhouse. I had built an empire that no one, not my ex-wife, not her father, not their failed schemes, could take from me. And that was only the beginning. That evening, I stepped into my penthouse, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass walls. A drink in my hand. My phone vibrated once more. Another message. From her. I should have ignored it, but something in me wanted to see what she had to say. I opened it. I just want to talk. One last time. I exhaled, setting my drink down. I didn't know her anything, but I wanted to see what her last move would be. So, against my better judgment, I sent a single response. Tomorrow. Noon. My office. The next day, at exactly noon, she walked into my office. She was still as polished as ever, still carried herself with the same effortless confidence. But there was something different now, a hesitation in her step, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She took a seat across from me, crossing her legs carefully. "You look good," she said after a moment. I didn't respond. I just studied her. She sighed. "I don't know how to start this conversation." "Then don't." Her jaw tightened slightly, but she forced a small smile. "I made a mistake." "You made a choice," I corrected. "And it was the wrong one," she admitted. I tilted my head slightly. "Didn't seem wrong when you sat across from me at that dinner table, letting your father replace me like an employee past his expiration date." She flinched at that. "Good." "I was stupid," she said, her voice quieter. "I let my father control everything. I let him make the decisions, thinking it was what was best for me. But I see now." She swallowed. "I see that I lost the one thing that actually mattered." I leaned back, watching her. "And what was that?" I asked, my voice unreadable. She hesitated. "You." I laughed. I didn't even mean to. It just came out. "You didn't lose me," I said, shaking my head. "You threw me away. There's a difference." Her eyes flickered with emotion. "Do you really hate me that much?" I exhaled slowly. "No, I don't hate you. I just don't care anymore." She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw the realization dawn in her eyes. This wasn't a game she could win. Not this time. "You wanted to talk," I said, standing up. "Now we've talked. I have work to do." She rose to her feet, looking like she wanted to say more. But in the end, she didn't. She just nodded once, turned, and walked out of my office. And this time, I knew she wouldn't come back. As the door shut behind her, I exhaled. Not because I felt relief, not because I felt anger, because, for the first time in a long time, I felt absolutely nothing, and that meant I had truly won. The door clicked shut behind her, and for the first time since this war began, I felt nothing. No rage, no regret, no satisfaction, just a cold, quiet finality. It was over. She had walked out of my life the moment she let her father erase me. And today, I had returned the favor. I turned back to my desk, my fingers grazing the sleek surface as I exhaled. There were no more distractions, no more betrayals to uncover, no more battles left to fight. I had one. And yet, the city outside my office window kept moving, untouched by the war I had waged and won. The world didn't stop for victory. Neither could I. My phone buzzed. Danielle's voice came through the speaker. "The reporters are still requesting an interview. They want to know your official statement now that everything is settled." I smirked, shaking my head. "Let them speculate." I didn't owe anyone an explanation. "Understood," she said. A pause. "By the way, your ex-wife just left the building." "I know." She looked different, not as sure of herself. "She'll adjust," I said simply. Danielle didn't press further. She never did. She understood me better than most. "One more thing," she said. "Your father-in-law has officially stepped down from all his remaining positions. He's off every board, out of every financial circle. The investors have cut ties. He's irrelevant now." I nodded. Good. That was the final piece. The last loose thread. He had spent decades ruling from behind a desk, controlling people like pieces on a chessboard. He had built a name, a reputation, a legacy. And now, he was just another forgotten businessman. Poetic. There's one last issue, Danielle said carefully. His lawyers reached out. He's requesting a meeting. I exhaled. Of course he is. He wouldn't go down without trying to salvage something. Some piece of his power, some remnant of his former life. Set it up, I said. My office. Tomorrow. Are you sure? I want to see the look on his face when he realizes there's nothing left for him to take. Danielle didn't argue. Tomorrow. 10 a.m., she confirmed. I hung up, staring out at the city. Tomorrow, I would bury the past for good. The final meeting. At exactly 10 a.m., my office door swung open. My father-in-law walked in, but he wasn't the same man he had been months ago. Gone was the confidence, the arrogance, the quiet certainty that he was always in control. He looked old, small, defeated. He took a seat without waiting for permission, but there was no power in the gesture. I won't waste time, he said, his voice rougher than before. I know what you think of me. I know you believe this is over. I didn't respond. I just watched him. But you don't understand something, he continued, leaning forward slightly. Power never truly disappears. It shifts. Today, you have it. But tomorrow? It could be someone else. I smiled slightly. Is that a warning? It's a lesson, he said, one I had to learn the hard way. One day, someone younger, smarter, and hungrier than you will come for what you built. And if you're not careful, you'll be sitting in this chair, having this conversation. I studied him. He wasn't wrong. Power was never permanent. It had to be defended, strengthened, reinvented. But I wasn't him. I hadn't built my empire on family loyalty or empty favors. I had built it on strategy, control, and absolute leverage. I appreciate the advice, I said smoothly, but I'm not you, and I won't make your mistakes. He exhaled, shaking his head. We'll see. Silence stretched between us. Why are you here? I asked. I want one thing, he said finally. A seat at the table. I laughed, shaking my head. You had a seat. You lost it. I built this company. And I built it into something bigger than you ever could, I countered. This isn't your legacy anymore. It's mine. His jaw tightened. Then at least let me buy back in, he pushed. Name your price. There is no price. A flicker of something crossed his face. Frustration. Maybe even desperation. You're shutting me out completely? You shut yourself out, I said simply. You made a choice. Now, you live with it. His hands curled into fists on the desk, but there was nothing left for him to fight. You'll regret this, he muttered. No, I said. You will. He stood abruptly, shoving his chair back. I hope you enjoy this power while it lasts, he said. Because one day, you'll look around and realize you're alone. I met his gaze without flinching. Alone is better than betrayed, I said. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. And just like that, the war was truly over. The legacy they couldn't steal. That evening, I sat in my office, the city stretching before me. Everything had changed. The company was mine, the empire was secured, and the people who had tried to take it from me were gone. I had built something no one could steal. Not my ex-wife. Not her father. Not anyone. And now? Now, I wasn't just defending my power. I was expanding it. A knock at the door. Danielle stepped in, her expression unreadable. You did it. Of course I did. She nodded, then hesitated. So what now? I smirked, leaning back in my chair.
Now?
I echoed. Now, I make sure no one ever forgets who built this empire. She studied me for a moment, then smiled slightly. I never doubted you. As she left, I turned back to the city. They tried to erase me. They tried to replace me. They failed. Because Hastings Enterprises wasn't just a business anymore. It was my legacy, and I would make sure no one ever took it from me again. After I punched my wife's brother for pouring hot spaghetti on my head at the family reunion, everyone ignored me, even my wife. You should take every insult and apologize, she said. Instead of apologizing, I bought a one-way ticket to Hawaii. 5 minutes later, I received 315 desperate messages and calls. So here's the thing about family reunions. They're like root canals, except at least with root canals, you get good drugs and nobody expects you to smile through the whole damn thing. But there I was, sitting in this barn-style dining hall that looked like someone had watched too many episodes of Fixer Upper and decided rustic chic was the way to go, surrounded by the Prescott clan in all their designer-clad glory. The smell hit you like a freight train the second you walked in, marinara sauce bubbling away in those industrial-sized warmers, garlic bread that probably came from some fancy bakery in the city, and enough cologne and perfume to choke a horse. Seriously, Uncle Howard must have bathed in that stuff. I'm pretty sure I caught a contact high, just sitting downwind from the guy. I'd strategically positioned myself at the long pine table like some kind of social warfare expert, hands folded in front of me like I was back in 3rd grade waiting for Mrs. Henderson to tell me whether my book report on Where the Red Fern Grows was going to cut it. You know that feeling when you're trying so hard to blend into the furniture that you practically become one with the wood grain? Yeah, that was me. Human wallpaper at the Prescott Family Spectacular. But then there was Marissa, my wife of 6 years, and man, she was absolutely glowing. I'm talking full-on lighthouse beacon here, laughing at something her cousin Sophie had just whispered in her ear. Her whole face lit up in a way I hadn't seen since. Hell, I couldn't even remember the last time. Maybe our honeymoon. Before reality set in, and she realized she'd married the guy who shops at Target instead of Nordstrom and thinks a fancy dinner is anything that doesn't come in a drive-through bag. The rest of her family had claimed their spots around the table like they were marking territory. Uncle Howard sat there in his tailored blazer that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. And my car isn't exactly a beater, mind you. The guy looked like he'd stepped out of a whiskey ad, all Silver Fox confidence, and I own half the city energy. Then there was Aunt Margot, dripping in so much gold jewelry, she could have been mistaken for a walking Fort Knox exhibit. Every time she moved, it sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane. And then, of course, there was Tristan. Tristan. Marissa's beloved brother, who'd made it crystal clear from day one that I wasn't exactly his first choice for brother-in-law material. The guy had the kind of face that screamed, I peaked in prep school, and I'm gonna make that everyone else's problem. 6 years we'd been doing this dance. 6 years of him looking at me like I was something he'd scraped off his Italian leather shoes. The conversation flowed around me like I was a rock in a stream. All talk about ski trips to Aspen that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Wine tastings in Napa, where they probably spent more on a bottle than I made in a week, and exclusive charity galas that had guest lists tighter than Fort Knox. You know, the kind of events where they don't just check your name at the door, they check your net worth, your family tree, and probably your credit score while they're at it. I nursed my water like it was liquid courage, which, let's face it basically was at this point. The ice cubes clinked against the glass every time my hands shook just a little. Not from nerves, mind you, but from the sheer effort it took to keep my mouth shut while they talked about their problems, like whether the caviar at last week's fundraiser was subpar or if their personal trainers were charging too much for house calls. So the decorator says the marble we picked out might clash with the new chandelier, Aunt Margot was saying, waving her fork around like she was conducting an orchestra. Can you imagine? After we specifically told him we wanted something that would complement the existing color scheme. Sophie nodded sympathetically, like this was truly one of life's great tragedies. Oh, the same thing happened to us with the pool house renovation. You really can't trust anyone these days. I took another sip of water, wondering if anyone would notice if I just slowly slid under the table and army crawled my way to freedom. Probably not. I was about as invisible to these people as their housekeeping staff. That's when Tristan decided to make his move. He'd been eyeing me all evening like a cat watching a mouse, just waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. He leaned forward, that trademark smirk spreading across his face like spilled wine on white carpet. Ugly and impossible to ignore. Grayson, he drawled, and I swear the temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. You're being awfully quiet tonight. What's the matter, buddy? Did your little hometown never teach you how to keep up with adult conversation? The chuckles that rolled down that table hit me like a slap in the face. Not the kind of genuine laughter you hear when someone tells an actually funny joke, but that polite, superior kind of laughter that says, "We're laughing at you, not with you, and we want to make sure you know it." I felt my jaw clench, felt that familiar heat creeping up my neck that always showed up when I was about 2 seconds away from saying something that would probably end with me sleeping on the couch. But I forced myself to smile. One of those tight, fake smiles that feels like it might crack your face in half if you hold it too long. Just enjoying the conversation. I managed to get out, my voice steady, even though my hands were practically vibrating with the effort it took not to reach across the table and show Tristan exactly what this small-town boy had learned about conflict resolution. But that wasn't good enough for him. Oh no, Tristan was just getting warmed up. I mean, we're talking about real estate in the Hamptons, and you look like someone just started speaking ancient Greek. Maybe we should switch to discussing. I don't know, what do people talk about where you're from? Tractor pulls? County fair pie contests? More laughter. Louder this time. Even Uncle Howard cracked a smile, like watching his nephew tear apart his niece's husband was quality family entertainment. I caught Marissa's eye across the table, looking for backup, for solidarity, for anything that resembled the us against the world mentality we used to have. Instead, I got that look, the one I'd become way too familiar with over the past few years. That subtle shake of the head, that slight narrowing of the eyes that said, "Don't you dare make a scene," louder than if she'd screamed it across the room. "Let it go," that look said. "Just take it and smile and pretend like it doesn't bother you, because heaven forbid we upset the delicate ecosystem of Prescott family dynamics." So I sat there, water glass sweating in my palm, marinara sauce growing cold on the serving platters, surrounded by the sound of their laughter and the smell of their expensive cologne, and I let it go. Just like I always did. Just like they expected me to. But something was different this time. Something was building in my chest, hot and tight and dangerous. Maybe it was the way Tristan's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Or maybe it was the way Marissa looked away like she was embarrassed to be married to me. Or maybe it was just 6 years of this crap finally reaching its breaking point. Whatever it was, I had a feeling this family reunion was about to get a lot more interesting than anyone had bargained for. You know how they say time slows down right before a car crash? Well, apparently the same thing happens right before your brother-in-law decides to turn you into a walking Italian restaurant advertisement. 1 second I'm sitting there picking at my Caesar salad, which, by the way, had enough anchovies to stock a small aquarium. And the next second, I'm watching Tristan rise from his chair like some kind of designer-clad villain in a really twisted dinner theater production. The conversation had moved on from my apparent lack of sophistication to discussing their latest investment properties. Uncle Howard was going on about some waterfront condo he'd just snagged in Miami, gesturing with his wine glass like he was conducting a symphony of his own awesomeness. "The view from the penthouse is absolutely divine," he was saying. "You can see clear to the horizon on a good day." "Oh, Howard, you simply must show us the photos again," Aunt Margot gushed, her gold bracelets jangling like a one-woman percussion section. "The marble in that kitchen is just exquisite." I was trying to calculate exactly how many months of my salary that condo probably cost when Tristan made his move. He stood up smooth as silk, reaching for the big ceramic serving dish that held enough spaghetti marinara to feed a small Italian village. For a split second, I thought he was just going for seconds. Hell, the guy ate like he had a hollow leg, probably burned calories just from being such an ass. But then I saw it. That look in his eyes. The same look he'd had at Marissa's and my wedding when he'd accidentally bumped into me during the father-daughter dance, causing me to stumble and nearly take out the whole wedding party like bowling pins. Pure, calculated malice wrapped up in a Polo Ralph Lauren package. "Grayson," he said, his voice dripping with fake concern, "you look a little pale. Maybe you need some color in your life." That should have been my cue to duck, to roll, to do literally anything except sit there like a deer in headlights. But my brain was still processing the fact that a grown man, a 34-year-old investment banker who wore cufflinks to casual dinners, was actually considering what I thought he was considering. And then he did it. The ceramic dish tilted, and suddenly I was getting an up-close and personal introduction to every ingredient in Aunt Margot's famous marinara recipe. Hot sauce hit my scalp first, then came the noodles, long, slimy pasta sliding down my face like the world's worst facial treatment. The temperature was somewhere between fresh from the stove and third-degree burn, and I felt every drop as it soaked through my button-down shirt and pooled in my lap. For exactly 3 seconds, the entire dining hall went dead silent. Not the comfortable kind of quiet you get when everyone's focused on their food, but that horrible, suffocating silence that happens when 30 people simultaneously realize they just witnessed something that definitely wasn't in the evening's program. Then Tristan started laughing. It wasn't just a chuckle or even a regular laugh. This was the kind of deep, belly-shaking laughter that comes from pure, unadulterated joy at someone else's humiliation. The sound echoed off the barn-style walls, bouncing around the room like it was specifically designed to make sure everyone heard just how funny he found the sight of his sister's husband wearing dinner instead of eating it. I sat there for a moment, sauce dripping from my chin onto my ruined shirt, noodles hanging from my hair like the world's most pathetic Christmas ornaments. Around the table, I could see everyone's faces frozen in various expressions of shock, amusement, and what might charitably be called concern if you squinted really hard and had a vivid imagination. Aunt Margot had her hand pressed to her chest like she was having vapors, but her eyes were bright with the kind of excitement people get when they witness a really good train wreck. Sophie was covering her mouth, but I could see the grin underneath her fingers. Uncle Howard was shaking his head, but more in the boys will be boys way than the this is completely unacceptable way. And Marissa? Marissa just sat there looking like someone had told her the stock market had crashed and taken her trust fund with it. Not horrified that her husband had just been publicly humiliated, not angry that her brother had just crossed about 15 different lines of basic human decency, just disappointed. Like I'd somehow failed her by existing in the same space as flying pasta. That's when something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the way the sauce was starting to burn my scalp, or maybe it was the sound of Tristan's continuing laughter, or maybe it was just 6 years of swallowing every insult, every slight, every joke at my expense finally reaching critical mass. But I stood up, pasta falling from my shoulders like some kind of carb-heavy confetti, and I felt my right hand ball into a fist before my brain even caught up with the program. The punch connected with Tristan's jaw with a sound that was part slap, part crack, and entirely satisfying. Physics took over from there. His head snapped back, his designer loafers lost their grip on the polished floor, and he went down like a sack of overpriced potatoes, taking a chair with him in a crash that would have made a stuntman proud. The silence that followed was somehow even more complete than before. This wasn't shocked silence. This was, holy crap, the quiet guy just laid out the golden boy silence. The kind of quiet that makes you realize you can hear the air conditioning humming and someone's stomach growling 3 tables over. Aunt Margot was the first to break. "Tristan," she shrieked, rushing to her precious nephew like he'd been shot instead of simply introduced to the concept of consequences. "Someone call a doctor. He could have a concussion." Uncle Howard was muttering something about keeping things civil and what will people think, because apparently the real tragedy here wasn't that his nephew had just assaulted someone with dinner, but that it might reflect poorly on the family name. Sophie was wide-eyed, phone already out, probably texting her friends about the drama unfolding in real time. OMG, you guys are not going to believe what just happened at the reunion. And through it all, Marissa remained seated, not jumping up to check if I was hurt, not telling her family that what Tristan did was completely out of line, not even asking if I was okay. She just sat there, staring at me like I'd committed some unforgivable sin by defending myself. Tristan was starting to come around, Aunt Margot fussing over him like he was made of spun glass instead of entitlement and bad decisions. His jaw was already starting to swell, and I couldn't help but think it was a good look on him. Really brought out the asshole in his eyes. "You're insane," he mumbled through what I hoped was going to be a spectacular bruise. I was just having a little fun. Fun, right? Because nothing says good times like assault with a deadly marinara. I wiped sauce from my eyes, feeling it stick to my fingers like some kind of Italian-flavored superglue, and looked around the room at all these people who were supposed to be family. Not a single person had moved to help me clean up. Not one napkin had been offered. Nobody had said, "Hey, maybe dumping hot food on someone isn't exactly appropriate dinner behavior." Instead, they were all looking at me like I was the problem. Like I was the one who'd violated some sacred family code by having the audacity to hit back when someone literally poured dinner on my head. The marinara was starting to cool, which somehow made it feel even worse. going from scalding humiliation to cold, sticky shame in real time. I could feel it soaking through my shirt, probably staining my undershirt too, and I wondered absently if marinara sauce was one of those things that never really comes out no matter how much bleach you throw at it. Standing there in that barn-style hall, surrounded by fake rustic charm and real family dysfunction, covered in pasta sauce and noodles like some kind of demented scarecrow, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. I wasn't family to these people. I was entertainment. A target. The designated punching bag they could all feel superior to when they needed a boost to their collective ego. And the worst part? Marissa was just going to let it happen. Again, walking out of that dining hall felt like escaping from a burning building. Except instead of smoke, I was leaving behind a cloud of designer perfume, passive-aggressive tension, and the lingering smell of marinara sauce that was probably going to haunt my nostrils for the next week. The wide porch wrapped around the front of the reunion hall like a wooden embrace, and for the first time all evening, I could actually breathe without feeling like I was drowning in other people's expectations. The night air hit my sauce-covered face like a cool slap of reality. Out here, away from the theatrical gasps and pearl-clutching performance art happening inside, I could finally hear myself think. Unfortunately, what I was thinking wasn't exactly suitable for polite company. I grabbed my shirt sleeve and started wiping marinara off my cheeks, which was about as effective as trying to clean up a crime scene with a tissue. But hey, at least I was doing something productive. My hair was still sticky with sauce, and every time I ran my fingers through it, I came away with more evidence of Tristan's idea of family fun. Chunks of tomato, bits of basil, and enough garlic to ward off every vampire in a 50-mile radius. I probably looked like I'd lost a fight with a pasta factory, which, come to think of it, wasn't that far from the truth. The porch light buzzed overhead like an angry wasp, casting everything in that yellowish glow that makes everyone look like they're coming down with jaundice. I leaned against the wooden railing, feeling the splinters through my ruined shirt, and tried to process what had just happened in there. In the span of about 10 minutes, I'd gone from invisible family disappointment to public enemy number one, all because I'd had the audacity to defend myself when someone literally dumped dinner on my head. That's when I heard the screen door creak behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. I could practically feel the waves of disapproval radiating from the doorway like heat from a furnace. Marissa's footsteps were crisp against the wooden planks, each one sounding like a little judgment hammer hitting the nail of my coffin. "Well," she said, and I could hear her crossing her arms without even looking. That was quite a performance in there. I turned around slowly, sauce still dripping from my collar, and looked at my wife of 6 years. The woman I'd promised to love, honor, and cherish until death do us part. The woman who was currently looking at me like I'd just kicked a basket of puppies in front of a group of kindergartners. "Performance?" I said, my voice coming out rougher than I'd intended. "Your brother just dumped hot pasta on my head, and you think I put on a performance?" She was doing that thing she did when she was trying to be reasonable, tilting her head slightly to the side, speaking in that measured tone that therapists probably learn in school. "You know how Tristan is," she said, like that explained everything. Like how Tristan was some kind of natural disaster we all just had to learn to live with, like hurricanes or tax season. "Yeah," I said, wiping more sauce off my neck. "I know exactly how Tristan is. He's an entitled jackass who thinks other people exist solely for his entertainment." Marissa's expression didn't change, which somehow made it worse. If she'd gotten angry, if she'd yelled, if she'd shown any kind of emotion at all, I might have been able to work with that. But this cold, clinical disappointment? This was like trying to argue with a customer service robot. "You should apologize," she said, and for a second I thought I'd misheard her. Maybe the marinara had gotten in my ears along with everything else. I should what now? Apologize? To Tristan? To the family? "You embarrassed all of us tonight." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, for the moment when she'd crack a smile and tell me she was kidding. But her face remained as serious as a tax audit, and I realized she was completely, 100% sincere. "Let me get this straight," I said, feeling that dangerous heat building in my chest again. "Your brother pours scalding hot food on my head in front of 30 people, and I'm the one who needs to apologize?" "You know how important these family gatherings are," she continued, like I hadn't spoken at all. "Uncle Howard was talking about potentially bringing you into one of his investment projects. But after tonight, she trailed off, shaking her head like I'd just blown our shot at winning the lottery. And maybe I had, from her perspective. Maybe losing out on Uncle Howard's largesse was worse than watching her husband get publicly humiliated by her psychopath brother. You should take every insult and apologize, she said, and there it was. The mission statement of our marriage, laid out in plain English under a buzzing porch light, while I stood there covered in marinara sauce like some kind of walking Italian food advertisement. I should take every insult, every slight, every joke at my expense, every casual cruelty that her family dished out like party favors. And then I should apologize for existing, for breathing their air, for daring to marry above my station, and for getting my place in their carefully constructed social hierarchy. He poured hot food on me. I repeated, because apparently I needed to say it louder for the people in the back. Hot food on my head. Marissa shrugged, actually shrugged, like someone had asked her opinion about the weather. You know how Tristan is. There it was again. The ultimate excuse, the get-out-of-jail-free card that apparently covered everything from casual cruelty to actual assault. Tristan could probably burn down an orphanage, and Marissa would just shrug and say, well, you know how Tristan is. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled with 6 years of accumulated resentment and the sound of insects buzzing around the porch light. Inside, I could hear the muffled sounds of the family regrouping, probably already spinning the story into something where I was the villain and poor Tristan was the victim of my unprovoked attack. I'm not apologizing, I said finally. Not to him, not to them, not to anybody. Marissa's mouth tightened into that thin line that meant I'd just failed another test I didn't know I was taking. Then you're making a choice, Grayson. You're choosing your pride over our marriage, over our future, over everything we've built together. Everything we'd built together. Right. Like our marriage was some kind of joint construction project instead of 6 years of me slowly disappearing into the background while she chose her family's approval over her husband's dignity at every single turn. What exactly have we built, Marissa? I asked, spreading my arms wide, sauce flying off my sleeves. A relationship where your family treats me like garbage and you expect me to smile and ask for seconds? She didn't answer, just turned on her heel like I was a disappointing employee who'd just been fired. Her footsteps clicked across the porch planks with military precision, each step taking her further away from me and closer to the warm glow of family acceptance waiting inside. If you don't come back in there and make this right, she said without turning around, don't bother coming home tonight. And then she was gone, the screen door slamming behind her with a finality that echoed across the empty porch. I stood there alone under the buzzing light, marinara sauce cooling on my skin, listening to the distant sound of laughter from inside the hall. They were probably already back to discussing wine tastings and ski trips, the unpleasant interruption of my existence already filed away and forgotten. I looked down at my ruined shirt, at the sauce stains that would never come out, at the physical evidence of what happened when you tried to stand up for yourself in the Prescott family ecosystem. Then I looked at the door Marissa had just walked through, leading back to a world where I was expected to apologize for being humiliated, where my worth was measured by how much abuse I could absorb without fighting back. Standing there on that porch, with the night air cooling the sauce on my scalp and the sound of my in-laws' laughter drifting through the windows, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. If I walked back through that door, if I went back in there and apologized for defending myself, I'd be stepping right back into the same cage they'd kept me in for 6 years. The only question was whether I had the guts to stay outside. Driving away from that reunion hall felt like breaking out of prison, if prison was decorated in rustic barn chic and smelled like disappointed rich people. My hands were still shaking on the steering wheel, not from adrenaline anymore, but from something that felt suspiciously like freedom. Every mile I put between myself and the Prescott family circus was another breath of air that actually belonged to me. My phone had been buzzing like an angry hornet trapped in a jar ever since I'd gotten in the car, lighting up the dashboard with notification after notification. I could see Marissa's name flashing repeatedly, interspersed with numbers I recognized as various members of her family tree. Probably Uncle Howard trying to have a word with me, or Aunt Margot wanting to lecture me about proper family behavior. Or hell, Maybe even Tristan himself calling to gloat about his marinara masterpiece. But here's the thing about rock bottom. Once you hit it, you realize you've got nothing left to lose. And ignoring their calls felt better than any therapy session I'd ever imagined. 10 miles down the road, I spotted the familiar glow of a gas station rising out of the darkness like a fluorescent oasis. One of those 24-hour joints that looks like it was designed by someone who'd never seen daylight. All harsh white lighting and reflective surfaces that make everything look like a crime scene waiting to happen. I pulled into the parking lot, my tires crunching over gravel and discarded lottery tickets, and just sat there for a minute, engine ticking as it cooled. Through the windshield, I could see the usual late-night gas station ecosystem in full swing. A trucker filling up his rig while talking on a headset, probably explaining to his wife why he was running late again. A college kid counting out crumpled dollar bills for gas money, looking like he was calculating whether he'd have enough left over for ramen noodles. A woman in scrubs who was obviously pulling a double shift, moving with that particular kind of exhaustion that comes from keeping the world running while everyone else sleeps. Real people, living real lives, dealing with real problems. Not a single one of them was worried about whether their caviar was properly chilled or if their personal trainer was charging too much for house calls. I turned off the engine and really looked at myself in the rearview mirror for the first time since the pasta incident. I looked like I'd lost a fight with an Olive Garden kitchen, sauce stains on my shirt that were already setting into permanent reminders of tonight's festivities, my hair still sticky with marinara, and something in my eyes that I hadn't seen in years. It took me a minute to recognize what it was. It was possibility. Inside the gas station, the fluorescent lights hummed with the kind of white noise that makes you feel like you're in a spaceship. The clerk behind the counter looked up from his phone just long enough to nod at me, which was about 1,000 times more acknowledgement than I'd gotten from my in-laws all evening. I grabbed a bottle of water and some napkins, trying to clean the worst of the sauce off my face while I figured out what the hell I was going to do next. That's when I spotted the sign advertising free Wi-Fi, and suddenly I had a plan. Or maybe not a plan exactly, but at least an idea that didn't involve going home to face Marissa's disappointed silence or sleeping on the couch like a dog who'd had an accident on the carpet. I pulled out my phone, ignored the 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, and opened up a travel website. The screen loaded with all those cheerful vacation photos, couples holding hands on beaches, families laughing over dinner, people living their best lives in places where nobody gave a damn about your pedigree or your portfolio. Where do you want to go? The search bar asked, cursor blinking patiently like it had all the time in the world for me to figure out my life. Anywhere, I thought. Anywhere but here. Anywhere but back to that house where I'd spent 6 years shrinking myself down to fit into spaces that were never meant for me in the first place. Somewhere warm, somewhere far away, somewhere nobody knew my name or cared about my marriage or expected me to apologize for existing. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, and then I typed 4 letters that felt like a prayer, HAWA. The search results populated faster than I expected, like the universe was just waiting for me to finally make a decision. Flights to Honolulu, hotel deals, car rentals, all the infrastructure of escape laid out in neat little rows with prices and times and the promise of 80-degree weather year-round. I clicked on the first airline result and found myself staring at a departure time that made my heart skip. Flight 447 to Honolulu, departing in 5 hours and 12 minutes. Red-eye special. Probably full of honeymooners and people running away from their problems, which made it perfect for my current situation. The price made me wince a little. One-way tickets aren't exactly budget-friendly, especially when you're buying them at the last minute. But then I thought about Uncle Howard's condo that cost more than most people's houses, about Aunt Margot's jewelry collection that could probably fund a small country, about all the money the Prescott family threw around like confetti while treating me like I should be grateful for the privilege of breathing their air. Screw it. I pulled out my credit card, the one Marissa was always telling me to use more responsibly, the one that came with lectures about our budget and our future and our 5-year plan. Tonight, it was going to buy me something I hadn't had in years, a choice that was entirely my own. The booking process was surprisingly simple, like the website understood that people making these kinds of decisions at gas stations at 11 p.m. weren't looking for complicated forms and multiple confirmation screens. Name, card number, confirmation of seat assignment, and suddenly I was holding a digital boarding pass on my phone that said Grayson Mitchell, Honolulu, Hawaii, seat 23A. 23A. A window seat, which felt appropriate somehow. I'd be able to watch the mainland disappear beneath the clouds, watch everything I'd been trying so hard to fit into shrink down to nothing while I flew towards something completely unknown. The confirmation email hit my inbox with a cheerful ding, complete with helpful reminders about check-in times and baggage restrictions. Baggage restrictions. I almost laughed out loud right there in the gas station, surrounded by energy drinks and lottery tickets, and the smell of Roller Grill hot dogs. What baggage was I going to bring? The shirt covered in marinara sauce? The years of accumulated resentment? The wedding ring that suddenly felt like it weighed about 50 pounds? I paid for my water and walked back out to the car, phone buzzing again with another round of calls I had no intention of answering. 5 hours and 12 minutes until takeoff. Enough time to drive to the airport, park in long-term parking like I was going on a normal business trip instead of fleeing my entire life, and maybe grab some actual clothes that didn't look like they'd been used as target practice by an Italian restaurant. Sitting in the driver's seat, I looked at that boarding pass one more time. Grayson Mitchell, it said. Not Grayson Prescott adjacent. Not Marissa's disappointing husband. Not the guy who didn't quite fit in at family dinners. Just Grayson Mitchell, passenger, destination unknown. For the first time in 6 years, that felt like exactly the right name to be. You know that moment in action movies when the hero's phone starts going off like the world's most annoying alarm clock, and you just know that whatever peace and quiet they had is about to go straight to hell? Well, apparently my life had just turned into one of those movies, except instead of international spies or alien invasions, I was dealing with something far more terrifying. The collective wrath of the Prescott family. 5 minutes. 5 freaking minutes after I hit confirm purchase on that airline ticket, and my phone lit up like the 4th of July had a baby with Times Square on New Year's Eve. The thing was vibrating so hard against the dashboard that I was half worried it might achieve actual flight before I did. I'd barely pulled out of the gas station parking lot when the first wave hit. Call after call, text after text, voicemail notifications piling up faster than I could even read the names. It was like watching a social media meltdown in real time, except instead of strangers on the internet, it was my own family-in-law losing their collective minds because I'd had the audacity to leave their little performance without taking a bow. The irony wasn't lost on me that these people, who couldn't be bothered to offer me a napkin when I was sitting there covered in marinara sauce, suddenly had an urgent need to communicate now that I wasn't playing by their rules anymore. Marissa was leading the charge, naturally. Her name kept flashing on the screen like a neon sign advertising disappointment. "Where are you?" popped up in a text bubble, followed immediately by "Don't do this," and then "You're making a scene." Because apparently leaving quietly after being humiliated was somehow more dramatic than dumping hot pasta on someone's head in front of 30 people. The logic of the Prescott family, ladies and gentlemen, always consistent in its complete lack of consistency. But Marissa was just the opening act. The real show started when Tristan got involved. I could practically see him holding an ice pack to his jaw while frantically typing threats into his phone, probably feeling like the victim in all this. His messages started pouring in faster than I could delete them. "You're done," followed by, "I'll have you arrested," and my personal favorite, "You have no idea what you've started." When I'd started. Right. Because apparently throwing the first punch was dumping food on someone, and defending yourself was the real crime here. I was starting to think these people lived in some kind of alternate reality where normal cause and effect relationships had been suspended in favor of whatever narrative made them look good. Then Aunt Margot joined the party, and boy, did she come loaded for bear. Her messages read like they'd been dictated by a disappointed Victorian matriarch who'd just discovered that the servants had been using the good china. "We opened our family to you, and this is how you behave?" she wrote, as if they'd been doing me some kind of massive favor by tolerating my existence at their dinner table. "After everything we've done for you, this is the thanks we get?" Everything they'd done for me. Let's see. What exactly had they done for me over the past 6 years? They'd included me in family gatherings where I was either ignored or insulted. They'd made it crystal clear that I wasn't really welcome in their social circle. And they treated me like a charity case who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention they threw my way. Oh, and tonight they'd used me as target practice for Italian food. Truly, I was the luckiest man alive. Uncle Howard's messages were more restrained, but somehow more threatening, written in that careful corporate language that he probably used to fire people without technically breaking any labor laws. "Call me immediately," he wrote, followed by, "We need to discuss your future with this family." My future with this family. Like I was an employee whose contract was up for review instead of someone who'd married into their dysfunction. But the real kicker came from Sophie, Marissa's cousin, who apparently thought this was all some kind of entertaining family drama that she could live tweet for her friends. "OMG, everyone is so upset," she wrote, complete with crying laughing emojis. "Aunt Margot is literally shaking. Uncle Howard is pacing around talking about lawyers. This is better than reality TV. Better than reality TV." There it was, the family motto in all its glory. Real people's pain was just entertainment for them, something to spice up their otherwise boring lives of privilege and plenty. I wondered if Sophie was already planning to turn this into content for her Instagram story, maybe with some kind of inspirational quote about family loyalty overlaid on a picture of her avocado toast. The messages kept coming, a steady stream of outrage and demands and threats that painted a pretty clear picture of how the Prescott family handled anyone who dared to color outside their carefully drawn lines. They weren't worried about me as a person. Not one message asked if I was okay, or if I was hurt, or if I needed anything. They were worried about their image, their control, their ability to maintain the carefully constructed narrative where they were the generous benefactors and I was the grateful recipient of their largesse. I pulled over at a rest stop about 20 miles from the airport, partly because my phone was making it hard to concentrate on driving, and partly because I needed to see just how deep this rabbit hole went. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few long-haul truckers catching some sleep and a family with small kids making an emergency bathroom stop. Sitting there under the fluorescent lights of the rest stop, I started scrolling through the messages more carefully, and that's when I noticed something that shouldn't have surprised me, but somehow still did. Not a single one of them mentioned the fact that Tristan had dumped hot food on my head. Not one message said, "Hey, maybe my brother/nephew/son was out of line." Not one person suggested that pouring marinara sauce on someone might be considered inappropriate dinner behavior. It was all about my reaction, my violence, my overreaction to what they were probably already spinning as a harmless prank between family members. The actual assault, because let's call it what it was, had already been memory holed in favor of a story where I was the unstable one who couldn't take a joke. The counter on my phone showed 315 total notifications, and they were still climbing. 315 separate attempts to drag me back into their web of dysfunct. 315 reminders of why I'd bought that plane ticket in the first place. But here's what struck me as I sat there in that rest stop parking lot, surrounded by the honest exhaustion of people traveling for real reasons. Work, family visits, moving across the country for new jobs. These messages weren't from people who cared about me. They were from people who cared about maintaining their version of reality, where they could treat people however they wanted and never face any consequences. Not one message said, "Are you okay?" Not one person asked if the sauce had burned my skin or if I needed medical attention. Not one member of Marissa's family seemed to think that maybe, just maybe, they should be apologizing to me instead of demanding that I apologize to them. I looked at that growing pile of digital outrage, all those words and threats and demands, and realized something that felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. I didn't owe these people anything. Not an explanation, not an apology, not even a response. So I did something that felt better than any comeback I could have written, better than any angry phone call I could have made, better than any dramatic confrontation I could have staged. I turned off my phone and put it in my bag, cutting off their access to me as simply as flipping a switch. The silence that followed was more satisfying than any argument I'd ever won. You know how people always say that airplane air is recycled and gross and makes you feel like you're breathing through a dirty sock? Well, let me tell you something. After 6 years of breathing the suffocating atmosphere of Prescott family expectations, that recycled airplane air tasted like pure freedom with a hint of peanuts and possibility. The red-eye flight to Honolulu had been exactly what I'd needed. 5.5 hours of enforced silence with nothing but the hum of engines and the occasional snore from the businessman in 24B. No phone calls, no text messages, No family members trying to drag me back into their twisted version of reality. Just me, a tiny bag of pretzels, and the growing realization that I'd actually done it. I'd bought a one-way ticket to anywhere but here and followed through. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for that first breath of Hawaiian air. The plane doors opened, and it hit me like a warm hug from a grandmother you didn't know you had. Not the aggressive, in-your-face heat that makes you want to run back inside to air conditioning, but this soft, gentle warmth that seemed to wrap around you like the world's most expensive blanket. It was air with personality, air that smelled like flowers you couldn't name and ocean salt, and something that might have been happiness if happiness had a scent. I walked down that jet bridge feeling like I was entering a different universe entirely. The terminal at Honolulu International wasn't trying to impress anyone with marble floors or crystal chandeliers like the airports back home. Instead, it had this laid-back, "Hey, welcome to paradise. Try not to stress about anything" vibe that immediately made my shoulders drop about 3 inches. Hawaiian music was playing softly through speakers that didn't sound like they were trying to compete with the noise of stressed-out travelers. And everywhere I looked, people seemed to be moving just a little bit slower, a little bit easier, like they'd all collectively agreed that rushing around was probably not the best way to spend their time on Earth. The baggage claim was where it really hit me that I'd made a completely insane decision. Everyone else was standing around waiting for their carefully packed suitcases full of vacation clothes and sunscreen and all the things normal people bring when they plan a trip to Hawaii. Meanwhile, I was standing there with nothing but my wallet, my passport, and a single backpack that contained exactly one change of underwear and the business card for a divorce lawyer that I'd been carrying around for 2 years but never had the guts to call. That's when I realized I was going to need somewhere to stay, and probably some clothes that didn't smell like marinara sauce and poor life choices. I pulled out my phone, which I'd reluctantly turned back on once the plane landed, and started scrolling through Airbnb listings, trying to find something that said, "Yes, we welcome people who've just blown up their entire lives on a whim." Most of the listings looked like they'd been photographed by people who'd taken a masterclass in making small spaces look like luxury resorts. Lots of carefully staged photos with perfectly placed pineapples and artfully rumpled white linens that probably cost more per night than I made in a week. But then I found one that was different. The photos were clearly taken by someone who'd just pointed their phone at stuff and clicked. No fancy lighting or strategic fruit placement. Just a small beachfront place with weathered wooden furniture and windows that actually looked like they opened to let in real air instead of Instagram-worthy filtered light. The description was written by someone named Kimo, and it simply said, "Clean, quiet, close to beach. Good for people who want to think or people who want to stop thinking. Your choice." Perfect. I booked it for a week, which felt like either the most reasonable decision I'd made in years or the most irresponsible, depending on how you looked at it. The address led me to a taxi driven by a guy who introduced himself as Paolo and immediately started telling me about his cousin's shrimp truck that I absolutely had to try, his nephew's surf lessons that would change my life, and his grandmother's secret spot for watching sunsets that wasn't overrun with tourists taking selfies. The ride to the Airbnb was like a guided tour through everything I'd been missing while I was busy trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. We passed beaches where people were actually playing in the water instead of posing next to it, restaurants that looked like they'd been built by people who cared more about the food than the Instagram potential, and neighborhoods where kids were riding bikes and old men were playing chess in parks, and life seemed to be happening at a pace that actually made sense for human beings. You running away from something or running to something? Paolo asked as we pulled up to a small house that looked like it had been painted by someone who believed that blue should actually look like the ocean and green should actually look like plants. "Little bit of both," I said, which was probably the most honest thing I'd said to anyone in months. He nodded like this made perfect sense. Hawaii's good for that. The islands don't judge. They just let you figure out what you need to figure out. The house was exactly what the photos had promised. Nothing fancy, but clean and comfortable, and so close to the beach that I could hear the waves from the front porch. There was a small kitchen with everything you needed to make actual food, a living room with furniture that looked like it had been chosen for comfort rather than style, and a bedroom with windows that opened wide enough to let in the sound of the ocean. But the real revelation came when I met Kimo himself. I'd been expecting someone who'd been polished by years of dealing with tourists, someone who'd learned to smile on command and recommend overpriced restaurants. Instead, I got a guy in his 50s with hands that looked like they'd actually worked for a living and a laugh that sounded like it came from somewhere deep and genuine. "First time in Hawaii?" he asked, and when I nodded, he grinned. "Good. The island's got a way of showing you things you didn't know you needed to see. You here for business or pleasure?" "Honestly," I said, setting down my pathetic backpack in a living room that somehow felt more like home than any place I'd lived in the past 6 years. "I have absolutely no idea what I'm here for." Kimo's laugh filled the space like warm honey. "Even better. That means you're here for the right reasons." He handed me the keys and a handshake that felt like he actually meant it, like I was a person worth welcoming instead of a problem to be managed. "The ocean's right out that door," he said, pointing toward the back of the house. "Don't overthink it. Just go look at it for a while. The water's got a way of putting things in perspective." So that's what I did. I walked out to the beach behind the house, kicked off my shoes that still smelled faintly of family reunion disaster, and stood at the edge of the Pacific Ocean while the sun started its descent toward the horizon. For the first time in 6 years, nobody was telling me where to stand, how to act, or what to say. The waves didn't care about my family connections, my social status, or whether I belonged anywhere in particular. They just kept rolling in, one after another, like they had all the time in the world. Turns out when you're not spending every waking moment trying to decode the complex social dynamics of people who think you're beneath them, you have a surprising amount of time to figure out what you actually enjoy doing. Who knew? My first week in Hawaii developed a rhythm that felt so natural I started wondering if this was what normal people meant when they talked about work-life balance, instead of work-life complete psychological warfare. I'd wake up when my body felt like waking up, not because an alarm was screaming at me to get ready for another day of disappointment. And I'd walk out to the beach to watch the sunrise paint the sky in colors that didn't exist in the Prescott family palette. The mornings were the best part. There's something about being the only person on a beach at 6 a.m. that makes you feel like you've discovered a secret that the rest of the world hasn't figured out yet. The sand was cool under my bare feet. The water was this impossible shade of blue that made you wonder why anyone ever settled for swimming pools. And the air tasted like possibilities that didn't come with strings attached or family approval ratings. I'd walk for miles, picking up shells that nobody expected me to display properly or appreciate appropriately, watching crabs scuttle around like they had important business to attend to, and generally enjoying the novel experience of existing without constantly calculating how my behavior might reflect on the family name. After the beach walks came coffee and breakfast at this little cafe called Sunrise Shack that looked like it had been built by surfers who'd accidentally become excellent at making food. The owner, a woman named Keiko who had to be pushing 70 but moved like she was half that age, made coffee that could wake the dead and acai bowls that tasted like someone had figured out how to turn tropical paradise into breakfast. "You're the mainland guy staying at Kimo's place," she said on my third morning, not really asking. Island communities, I was learning, had their own communication networks that made social media look sluggish. "Guilty as charged," I said, wondering if being the mainland guy was going to come with its own set of expectations and requirements. "Good," she said, sliding a plate of fresh fruit across the counter. "Kimo says you look like you needed to get lost for a while. Hawaii's perfect for that. Getting lost. I like that way of thinking about it better than running away, or having a midlife crisis, or whatever psychological label the Prescott family was probably attaching to my disappearance. Getting lost implied that you might eventually find something, whereas running away suggested you were just a coward who couldn't handle adult responsibilities. The afternoons were for reading. I discovered that when you're not constantly stressed about family dinner performances or social obligations that felt like pop quizzes you hadn't studied for, you could actually concentrate on books for more than 10 minutes at a time. I'd grab something from the little bookstore in town, a place that clearly existed because the owner loved books, not because she'd calculated the optimal profit margins on literary fiction, and find a spot on the beach or at one of the outdoor cafes where nobody cared if you sat there for 3 hours nursing a single iced tea. It was at one of these cafes, a place called The Grind that had mismatched chairs and Wi-Fi that worked about 60% of the time, that I met Lonnie. She was at the table next to mine, hunched over a laptop and muttering things that sounded distinctly uncomplimentary about website design platforms. "You okay over there?" I asked after she'd called her computer something that would have made Aunt Margot clutch her pearls so hard she'd probably need medical attention. "Oh, I'm fantastic," she said, her voice dripping with enough sarcasm to fill a swimming pool. "Just trying to update my shop's website, and this piece of garbage platform is acting like I asked it to solve world hunger instead of add a simple photo gallery." Lonnie, as it turned out, ran a surf shop called Wave Rider that had been in her family for 20 years. She was about my age, with sun-bleached hair and hands that looked like they'd spent a lot of time fixing things, and she had absolutely zero patience for technology that didn't work the way it was supposed to. "What kind of shop?" I asked, closing my book because this conversation was infinitely more interesting than whatever literary masterpiece I'd been pretending to read. "Surf shop. Boards, gear, lessons for tourists who think they're going to become the next Kelly Slater after a 2-hour session." She gestured at her laptop screen like it had personally offended her ancestors. "We do pretty well, but our website looks like it was designed in 1995 by someone who'd never seen the internet before." Here's where things got interesting. Back in my previous life, the one where I spent most of my time trying to disappear into furniture at family gatherings, I'd actually been pretty good at website design. It was something I'd picked up in college and kept doing on the side, mostly for small businesses that couldn't afford the big fancy agencies that charged more for a logo than most people made in a month. "I might be able to help with that," I said, surprised to hear myself volunteering for something without first calculating how it might affect my standing with people I was trying to impress. Lonnie looked up from her laptop, squinting at me like she was trying to figure out if I was serious or just another mainland tourist who thought he could solve all of Hawaii's problems with his superior continental wisdom. "You know anything about websites?" she asked. "A little," I said, which was probably the most understated thing I'd said since arriving in paradise. "Mind if I take a look?" What followed was the most fun I'd had working on anything in years. Lonnie's existing website was indeed a disaster of epic proportions. Broken links, photos that loaded sideways, and a color scheme that looked like it had been chosen by someone who'd never seen an actual ocean. But it wasn't unfixable, just neglected. We spent the next 3 hours completely rebuilding the thing from scratch. Lonnie provided the content and the vision. She knew exactly what her customers needed and how they thought, while I handled the technical stuff that made her want to throw her laptop into the nearest volcano. "You want clean, simple, easy to navigate," I said, pulling up examples of sites that actually worked. "Nothing fancy, just functional. People want to see your boards, check your lesson schedules, maybe read some reviews from happy customers." "Exactly," she said, and I realized it had been months since someone had responded to one of my ideas with genuine enthusiasm instead of polite tolerance or outright dismissal. By the time we finished, Wave Rider had a website that actually looked like it belonged to a business that knew what it was doing. The photos loaded properly, the navigation made sense, and the whole thing had a clean, professional look that still felt relaxed and welcoming. "How much do I owe you?" Lonnie asked as we tested the final version on her phone. "Nothing," I said, surprising myself again. It was fun. Fun. She looked at me like I'd just claimed that root canals were my favorite hobby. "You think website design is fun? When it's not for people who treat you like their personal tech support slave." "Yeah, it's actually pretty enjoyable." That's when she made me an offer that would change everything. I've got a couple of friends who run businesses around here. They're all dealing with the same kind of website disasters. If you're interested in picking up some side work while you're getting lost, I could put in some good words. Side work. Not charity, not family obligations, not doing favors for people who'd never return them. Actual work that I'd chosen to do, for people who appreciated it, at my own pace and on my own terms. Sitting there at that mismatched table, watching the sun start its descent toward the horizon while Lonnie scrolled through her new website with obvious satisfaction, I realized something that should have been obvious but somehow felt revolutionary. This was the first time in years that I'd done work that felt like it belonged to me. Not work that I did to impress my in-laws, not projects designed to boost my standing in some social hierarchy I'd never signed up for, but actual work that solved real problems for real people who treated me like a human being instead of a convenient disappointment. "Yeah," I said, watching a couple of surfers paddle out to catch the evening waves. I think I'd like that. 2 weeks in paradise had done something weird to my relationship with technology. Back in my old life, my phone was basically a digital leash that kept me connected to every disappointment, obligation, and passive-aggressive family text thread that made up my daily existence. Here in Hawaii, the thing had been sitting in a drawer like a piece of radioactive waste that I was pretty sure would kill me if I got too close to it. But eventually, reality has a way of knocking on your door, even when that door happens to be attached to a beachfront bungalow in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. My phone battery had finally died sometime during week 1, and I'd been perfectly content to let it stay that way. Dead phones can't deliver bad news, can't remind you of the life you left behind, and can't buzz with notifications from people who think you owe them explanations for your own happiness. Unfortunately, they also can't be used to run a business, and Lonnie's referrals were starting to pile up faster than I could handle with just her laptop and the questionable Wi-Fi at the grind. 3 local businesses wanted website overhauls, 2 needed complete e-commerce setups, and a local artist wanted an online gallery that didn't look like it had been designed by someone who'd learned HTML from a cereal box. So there I was, standing in the little electronics shop in downtown Honolulu, holding a phone charger and trying to work up the courage to plug my phone back into the world I'd left behind. The shop owner, a guy named Dave who looked like he'd been selling electronics since before smartphones were even a twinkle in Steve Jobs' eye, was watching me stare at the charger like it might explode. "You okay, man?" he asked. "You look like you're about to defuse a bomb instead of charge a phone." "Something like that," I said, handing him a 20 and wondering if there was any way to SE. Back at the bungalow, I plugged the thing in and watched it slowly come back to life with all the enthusiasm of someone waiting for their STD test results. The Apple logo appeared, followed by the home screen, followed by the most ridiculous notification badge I'd ever seen in my life. 347 unread messages. 347. I sat there on Chemo's comfortable old couch, listening to the waves crash outside, and watching that number blink at me like a neon sign advertising everything I'd been successfully avoiding for the past 2 weeks. Part of me wanted to throw the phone right back in the drawer and pretend I'd never seen it. Part of me was curious about just how deep the rabbit hole of family outrage had gotten in my absence. Curiosity won, because apparently I'm a glutton for punishment. The voicemail box was completely full, 37 messages that I was pretty sure would contain enough guilt, manipulation, and threats to power a small city. I started with those, figuring I might as well get the worst of it over with first. Marissa's voice hit me like a cold slap of reality. The first few messages were angry, really angry. "Where the hell are you, Grayson? You can't just disappear like this. We need to talk. Call me back immediately." Her voice had that sharp edge it got when she was trying to control something that wasn't cooperating, like a broken appliance or a husband who'd finally grown a backbone. But as the messages progressed, the anger shifted to something that was almost worse, strategic crying. By message number 12, she was sobbing into the phone about how worried she was, how she just wanted to know I was safe, how we could work through this if I'd just come home and talk to her like a reasonable adult. "I know you're hurt," she said in one message that was clearly performed for an audience. "I know things got out of hand at the reunion, but running away isn't the answer, Grayson. We're married. We made vows. You can't just abandon everything because you had a fight with my brother." A fight with her brother. Right. Because that's what you call it when someone dumps hot food on your head and you defend yourself. A little disagreement between boys, nothing that couldn't be solved with a firm handshake and maybe a nice bottle of wine. Tristan's messages were exactly what you'd expect from someone whose jaw I'd rearranged with my fist. The first few were pure rage, promising legal action and making threats that probably would have scared me if I'd still been living in his world of consequences and social standings. "You're finished," he snarled in one particularly charming voicemail. "I'm going to destroy you. You'll never work in this town again. Never work in this town again." Like I was some kind of mob movie character instead of a guy who designed websites and had finally gotten tired of being treated like furniture. I almost laughed out loud at that one, sitting there in my beach bungalow with more work than I could handle and zero interest in whatever town he thought he controlled. But the later messages from Tristan were different, more calculated. "Look," he said in what was clearly meant to be his reasonable voice. "Maybe we both got a little heated. Why don't you come back and we'll talk this through like adults? Marissa's worried sick, and the family thinks you might be having some kind of breakdown. Some kind of breakdown. Translation: they decided I was mentally unstable, which was probably easier for them to accept than the possibility that their behavior had finally pushed someone past their breaking point. Uncle Howard's messages were all business, delivered in that smooth corporate tone that said he was used to fixing problems with money and influence. Grayson, this has gone far enough. You're embarrassing the family, and more importantly, you're hurting Marissa. I think we can find a way to make this work for everyone. Call me back, and we'll discuss your options. My options? Like I was an employee being offered a severance package instead of a person who'd finally decided to prioritize my own sanity over their dysfunctional family dynamics. Aunt Margot's messages were pure psychological warfare, listing every opportunity I was throwing away by behaving like an ungrateful child. We had plans for you, she said in one particularly manipulative voicemail. Howard was going to bring you into the business. We were going to help you build something real. But you've shown your true colors now, haven't you? Plans for me. Help me build something real. As if their version of my life was somehow more legitimate than whatever I might choose for myself. As if success could only be measured by how well I fit into their predetermined mold of what a proper Prescott family member should look like. But the real kicker came from Sophie, who'd apparently appointed herself the family's social media correspondent. Her messages were breathless updates on the family drama, delivered like she was reporting from the front lines of a particularly juicy reality show. Everyone's talking about you, she said in one message that was equal parts excited and horrified. Aunt Margot thinks you've joined a cult or something. Uncle Howard keeps muttering about hiring a private investigator. And Marissa? Oh my God, Marissa is acting like you died or something. She's telling everyone you're having a nervous breakdown. A nervous breakdown. There it was again, the family's preferred explanation for my sudden departure. Much easier to accept than the possibility that their golden boy had crossed a line and finally faced consequences for it. I scrolled through the text messages, which were more of the same. Guilt, manipulation, threats, and a stunning lack of self-awareness about what had actually happened that night. Not one message acknowledged that Tristan had assaulted me. Not one person suggested that maybe, just maybe, dumping hot food on someone wasn't appropriate family fun. It was all about my reaction, my over-response, my inability to take a joke and play along with their twisted version of family bonding. But here's what struck me as I sat there in that peaceful bungalow, listening to the sound of waves and feeling the warm Hawaiian breeze through the open windows. Their anger wasn't really about me leaving. It was about me leaving without permission, without explanation, without giving them the chance to control the narrative and manage the situation according to their preferred script. They weren't upset because they'd lost me. They were upset because they'd lost control of me. And that realization felt better than any apology they could have offered, better than any explanation they could have given, better than any attempt to make things right. I deleted every single message without responding to a single one. No explanations, no justifications, no carefully worded emails trying to make them understand my perspective. Just silence. The kind of silence that says more than any argument ever could. You know what's funny about making a decision that everyone back home thinks is completely insane? Eventually, you stop caring whether they think it's insane or not, and you start focusing on whether it's actually working out for you. And let me tell you, 3 weeks into my Hawaiian adventure, things were working out better than I had any right to expect. The website work that had started with helping Lonnie had turned into something that looked suspiciously like an actual business. Word travels fast in island communities, especially when that word is mainland guy who can make your crappy website stop sucking without charging you a fortune. My phone, the same phone that had been buzzing with family drama and threats just a week ago, was now ringing with calls from local business owners who had actual problems they wanted me to solve. There was Maria, who ran a food truck called Island Fusion and needed an online ordering system that didn't crash every time more than 3 people tried to use it simultaneously. There was Tommy, a fishing charter captain whose website looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never seen a boat, let alone been on one. And there was Elena, who made jewelry from beach glass and shells and wanted an e-commerce site that captured the spirit of her work without looking like every other generic craft store on the internet. Real work for real people with real problems. It was a revelation that probably shouldn't have been as surprising as it was, but after years of doing favors for Marissa's family connections, People who treated web design like some kind of mysterious voodoo and expected miracles while complaining about every invoice. Working with folks who actually appreciated what I was doing felt like discovering a new planet. The best part was that nobody here knew about my previous life as the family disappointment. To Maria, I was just the guy who fixed her website so customers could actually place orders without wanting to throw their phones into the ocean. To Tommy, I was the computer wizard who made his charter business look professional enough to compete with the big resort operations. To Elena, I was the person who figured out how to make her art look as beautiful online as it did in real life. None of them cared that I'd never been good enough for the Prescott family standards. None of them expected me to apologize for existing or to constantly prove that I deserved to breathe the same air as my social betters. They just wanted someone who could solve their problems without talking down to them or charging them like they were funding a space mission. The work was good, but the real breakthrough came on Friday evenings at the pier with Chemo. It had started accidentally. I'd been walking along the waterfront around sunset, trying to clear my head after a long day of coding, when I'd spotted him sitting on a bench with a cooler full of beer and a smile that could power the whole island. "Mainland guy," he called out, waving me over like we'd been friends for decades instead of casual acquaintances who'd exchanged maybe 50 words total. Perfect timing. I was just about to watch the sun do its thing, and beer always tastes better when you've got someone to share it with. That first Friday had turned into a weekly tradition that I looked forward to more than I'd looked forward to anything in years. Chemo had this way of talking that made everything seem both completely serious and totally relaxed at the same time. He'd worked construction for 30 years, raised 3 kids who were all doing well for themselves, and had opinions about everything from local politics to the best way to grill fish that were both informed and completely unpretentious. "You settling in okay?" he asked during our 3rd beer summit, watching a cruise ship slide past the harbor like a floating city of tourists who'd probably never see the real Hawaii. "Better than okay," I said, surprised to realize how true that was. "This place is starting to feel like home." "Good," he nodded, taking a long pull from his beer. "Hawaii's got a way of calling to people who need it. Not everyone hears it, but when you do, you know." We'd sit there watching the sun paint the sky in colors that didn't exist in any of the fancy art galleries the Prescott family liked to frequent, talking about everything and nothing while fishing boats headed out for the night shift and joggers made their evening rounds along the waterfront. Sometimes we'd talk about work. Chemo was full of stories about construction projects that had gone hilariously wrong and clients who'd made requests that defied both physics and common sense. Sometimes we'd talk about family, his kids, his grandkids, his wife who'd passed away 5 years ago, and who he still missed every single day. But mostly, we'd just exist in the same space without any pressure to perform or impress or justify our presence. It was the kind of friendship that developed naturally, based on mutual enjoyment of each other's company rather than social obligation or family connection or any of the complicated dynamics that had governed most of my relationships back in my previous life. "You ever miss it?" he asked one evening, gesturing vaguely in the direction of what I assumed was the mainland. "Whatever you left behind to end up here." I thought about that question longer than I probably needed to. Did I miss anything about my old life? The house that had never really felt like mine? The family gatherings where I was tolerated rather than welcomed? The constant feeling that I was failing some test that nobody had bothered to explain to me? "I miss the idea of it," I said finally. "I miss thinking that I had a place where I belonged, even if that place never actually existed." Chemo nodded like this made perfect sense. That's the difference between missing something real and missing something you wished was real. One's worth going back for, the other's just nostalgia for a life you never actually had. The more time I spent in Hawaii, the more I realized he was right. I wasn't homesick for my actual life. I was homesick for the version of my life that had never existed outside my own hopeful imagination. The version where Marissa's family accepted me as an equal, where Tristan treated me like a brother instead of a target, where I fit into their world without having to shrink myself down to accommodate their expectations. But that version had never been real, and pretending it might someday become real had cost me years of actual happiness in favor of hypothetical approval from people who'd never actually intended to give it. The island routine was healing something in me that I hadn't even realized was broken. Morning walks on the beach where nobody expected me to network or make small talk about my career prospects. Afternoons working on projects that people actually appreciated instead of endured. Evenings watching sunsets with a friend who liked me exactly as I was instead of constantly hinting at ways I could improve myself to better fit his social circle. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I was living a life that felt like it belonged to me instead of everyone else. The work I was doing was work I'd chosen, for people I genuinely liked, at a pace that felt sustainable instead of frantic. The friendships I was building were based on mutual respect and shared interests instead of family obligation or social climbing. It wasn't the life I'd planned when I was sitting in that gas station 3 weeks ago, buying a one-way ticket to anywhere that wasn't where I'd been. But it was a life that fit me in ways that my carefully constructed previous existence never had. And for the first time since I could remember, I was excited about tomorrow instead of dreading it. 3 months. 93 days since I'd walked out of that barn-style reunion hall covered in marinara sauce and bruised dignity, and I was sitting in a lawyer's office in downtown Honolulu, signing papers that would officially end the longest mistake of my adult life. The lawyer, a woman named Patricia Kim who had the kind of no-nonsense efficiency that made you understand why she'd built a successful practice, slid the final divorce papers across her desk with a smile that suggested she'd seen this particular brand of liberation many times before. "Congratulations," she said, as I signed my name on the last page. "You're officially a free man." Free man. The words hit me differently than I'd expected. Not with relief, exactly, and definitely not with regret, but with something that felt like possibility wrapped in acceptance. I was free, but more importantly, I was free by choice rather than circumstance. I'd chosen this path, step by step, decision by decision. From that first moment, I decided not to apologize for defending myself to this final signature that severed the last legal tie to a life that had never really fit. The apartment above Lonnie's surf shop had become available 2 weeks ago when the previous tenant, a yoga instructor named Rainbow, who was probably born with a much more conventional name, had decided to follow her chakras to Sedona or some other place where people took spiritual guidance from crystals seriously. Lonnie had offered me the space before it even hit the market, which was either a sign of friendship or a practical business decision based on the fact that I'd already fixed her computer system 3 times and installed a security camera that actually worked. Either way, I jumped on it faster than a tourist jumping away from a Portuguese man of war. The place was small. Basically a studio with a kitchen alcove and a bathroom that required some creative maneuvering, but it had windows that opened wide enough to let in the constant sound of waves and a view of the ocean that made every morning feel like a vacation commercial. Moving in had been the easiest relocation of my life, mainly because I owned exactly 3 suitcases worth of stuff and had developed a deep appreciation for the minimalist lifestyle. No family heirlooms to worry about. No furniture that came with emotional baggage. No wedding photos to pack away in boxes labeled, "Deal with this later." Just clothes, a laptop, some books, and a coffee maker that had become my most prized possession after discovering that Island Time included a much more relaxed approach to caffeine availability. The business had grown beyond anything I'd expected when I first helped Lonnie with her website disaster. Word of mouth in island communities travels faster than gossip at a high school reunion. And apparently, mainland guy who actually knows what he's doing and doesn't treat you like an idiot was a rare enough commodity to keep me busier than I'd ever been in my previous life. I had a steady stream of clients ranging from local restaurants to tour operators to artists who made everything from custom surfboards to jewelry that looked like the ocean had personally designed it. But the real revelation was that I was making more money doing work I actually enjoyed than I'd ever made trying to impress people who would never be impressed anyway. Turns out that when you're genuinely good at something and you work with people who appreciate what you do, the financial part tends to sort itself out without requiring family connections or social networking events that felt like endurance tests. The apartment came with a small desk that fit perfectly under the main window, positioned so I could look up from my laptop and watch surfers catching waves while I worked on whatever project was currently demanding my attention. Today it was a complete e-commerce overhaul for a local coffee roaster who'd been trying to sell his beans online using a system that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd heard about the internet, but never actually seen it. The ocean breeze carried through the open windows, rustling the curtains I'd bought at a local market from a woman who'd spent 20 minutes telling me about the traditional Hawaiian patterns while her granddaughter taught me how to pronounce mahalo correctly. It was the kind of interruption that would have driven me crazy in my old life, where every minute was scheduled and every interaction was measured against its potential value to my social standing. Here, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Buying curtains from someone who cared about the history behind the patterns, learning a word that meant more than just thank you in a language that belonged to this place I was slowly becoming part of. My phone, which had become a tool for actual work instead of a device for delivering family drama, buzzed with a text from Chemo, Sunset Beer Summit in 1 hour. Tommy caught some Ono today, and Elena's bringing her famous mac salad. You in? I looked at my laptop screen, where about 3 hours of work remained on the Coffee Roasters website, and realized something that would have shocked my former self. The work could wait. Not because I was lazy or irresponsible, but because I'd learned the difference between urgent and important, between other people's expectations and my own priorities. The website would get finished, the client would be happy, and the world would continue spinning without requiring me to sacrifice every moment of personal time on the altar of productivity. Definitely in. I texted back, closing the laptop and walking to the small closet where I kept the kind of clothes that prioritized comfort over appearance. Board shorts, t-shirts that had never seen an iron, and flip-flops that cost less than the socks I used to wear to family dinners. Walking down to the beach where our informal Friday group had started gathering, I passed the mirror that came with the apartment and caught a glimpse of someone I barely recognized. Tan from spending actual time outdoors instead of commuting between air-conditioned buildings. Relaxed in a way that went deeper than just the absence of stress. Happy, which was such a foreign concept that it had taken me weeks to identify the emotion correctly. The beach was already occupied by the usual suspects. Chemo with his cooler of beer and infinite supply of stories about construction mishaps. Tommy cleaning fish with the kind of expertise that comes from 40 years of knowing exactly how sharp your knife needs to be. Elena arranging food on a folding table like she was setting up for a photo shoot. And Lonnie emerging from her shop with a bag of ice and a grin that suggested she'd just closed a deal with some tourists who thought they were going to become professional surfers after one lesson. Mainland guy, Chemo called out, using the nickname that had somehow evolved from identifying description to term of endearment. Perfect timing. Tommy just finished telling us about the time he accidentally caught a monk seal and had to explain to the Coast Guard why he was hugging a federally protected species. This was my life now. Friday evening fish and beer with people who'd become family not through marriage or blood or social obligation, but through the simple process of choosing to show up for each other week after week. No dress code, no hidden agendas, no complex dynamics that required a decoder ring and a sociology degree to navigate. Just people who liked each other, sharing food and stories while the sun painted the sky in colors that never got old, no matter how many times you watched the show. I grabbed a beer from Chemo's cooler and settled into the sand, feeling the warmth that lingered from the day's sunshine and listening to Elena describe her latest jewelry project, while Tommy argued with Lonnie about the best bait for certain types of fish and Chemo planned his next home improvement disaster. Somewhere on the mainland, my former in-laws were probably still discussing my disappearance, still trying to figure out how to spin my departure into a story that made them look like the victims. Marissa had probably moved on, found someone more suitable to the family standards, someone who understood the importance of proper behavior at social gatherings and never confused self-respect with selfishness. And for the first time since I'd known any of them, I genuinely hoped they were happy. Not because I missed them or wanted to reconcile, but because their happiness was no longer connected to mine. They could live their lives according to their values, and I could live mine according to mine, and neither of us had to apologize for the incompatibility. The sun touched the horizon, turning the ocean into a mirror that reflected possibilities I was still discovering. Tomorrow I'd finish the coffee website, start planning a new project for a local artist, maybe take Lonnie up on her offer to teach me how to surf without embarrassing myself in front of the tourists. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, with people who liked me exactly as I was, in a place that felt like home in ways I'd never experienced before. The spaghetti incident seemed like something that had happened to someone else in another lifetime. Not because I'd forgotten it, but because it had become the beginning of something better instead of the end of something that had never really worked anyway. Hawaii wasn't just the place I'd escaped to. It was the place I'd finally remembered who I was supposed to be all along.